3 Greek mythology hours to sleep. The last war. Zeus, the god of war. Kratos echoes before the storm. There was a quiet on Olympus, a quiet not brought about by peace, but by the drawn breath between storms. The kind of quiet that seeps deep into the bones and settles like dust in halls of marble. Not even the gods dared break it, for even they were aware of what returned was not just fate, but reckoning, and reckoning has a sound, a beat, a weight, and it had returned. The skies above. Mount Olympus had once burst with lightning and joy, and fury now brooded under sulky gray. No thunder rolled, no winds howled, only the eternal hum of fear echoing in passageways. Laughter had long echoed even immortality, creaks with the weight of fear, and those who danced with stars once now waited in patience, observed in stillness, and felt something older than time creeping its way to them. At the pinnacle of Olympus, where the wind used to carry the scent of ambrosia, and now the naiads, song suspended the scent of iron and ancient flame, Zeus stood frozen on his throne, his beard unkempt, his fists clenched, but not with fury, but with anticipation. For there is stillness that comes before not war, but the acceptance that war cannot be avoided. The king of gods had ruled by lightning and law, and when they were no equal with terror, but terror cannot hit its target in the one who is already burnt. Through the world of mortals and into the places in between, there marched a name never spoken in temples, never sung in ode, but carried in whispers. Across fields in flame, a name no longer found within it or prophecy, but in a truth that sickened even the Titans. That name was Kratos. Then raged he across the skies as a weapon, as a servant of Olympus, bound in chains both visible and invisible, made a god by gods who believed themselves masters, and shattered by the same when his utility was exhausted. But steel never forgets the hand that shaped it, and Kratos was no longer fire. He was the coal that glows bright in darkness, the ember that survives long after the blaze is gone. Across the dark canyons of war-torn lands, where war was forgotten, and skeletons were all that remained, Kratos walked his steps, deliberate not in age, but in memory, with each step measured against each life. He had brought to the grave, not out of a desire for forgiveness, but because he remembered. Each face, each name, each breath. He drew from their lives. He walked not seeking vengeance, but because his path had ever been the forward path, and the forward path now equaled back to Olympus. The gods above were not looking with sympathy, but awe, for they too had memory. They remembered the thunder that shook the crimson clouds of blood. They remembered a warrior who stood not because he was blessed, but because he would never be broken. Again, they remembered that once he was theirs, and they had made him so Hermes strode as wind in a jar, his strides faster than thought, but even he could not outrun what was in store for him. He had outrun death previously, but death is just it comes once and is done with. But this was revenge, honed into resolve, tempered by loss, and no winged sandals would carry him out of its way. Athena stood where no one could see, in a position between rock and soul. She once guided him, not because she was benevolent, but because she had intent. She had witnessed something in Kratos that even Zeus feared not fury, not strength, but will, and will is the one thing Olympus cannot control. She had been slain by his own hand, and yet, even in her death, she watched not to stop him, but to see what he had become. In the spaces below, mortals looked up and felt the air grow dense. The birds flew closer. The rivers ran more quietly. Trees folded leaves to hide. Even nature understood that the old balance was broken, that the one who had broken the sky previously now started to get agitated again, not with rage, but with something more horrific, patience. Kratos did not wear the blades of chaos anymore. They hung where the fire never fades in the darkness of memory, bound not by metal, but by silence. He bore their scars, not as trophies, but as cautionary tales. They were not instruments. They were truths etched into his skin, like ink on scripture. Each a name, each a burn, a vow, not to forget, not to forgive. But peace was not silence. It was the space between storms, and the wind had changed. It came to him not as sound, but as remembrance. The laughter of his daughter is the smile of a wife who was dead, the flash of lives stolen by the gods. He had worshipped, and with those resonances came the understanding that rest was not for him to keep, not yet not, while Olympus stood firm. And so he stood once more against the ground beneath him, still as if not bravely daring to do twice what he had done. He moved not like a warrior, but like a gathering storm, low and slow and unyielding, not to scorch, not to destroy, but to complete what should have been finished a long time ago. And Olympus could feel it in its bones, in its roots, in the marble that no longer glimmered. Zeus felt it as well, not with fear, but the agony of need. He once threw lightning into the hearts of titans, tore the sky asunder, just to secure his throne. But thrones are only stable when the fear under them still trembles. And Kratos no longer feared him. No more, no, ever again. Hera wept, but not for Zeus, not for Olympus, she wept. Because she recalled when gods were more than strength, when they were tale and verse and radiance, and now they were nothing but fading silhouettes. Fighting with a man who did not wish to fade with them, she looked at Kratos and saw not destruction, but truth. And truth is a reflection that no god is ready to face. The stars were less ablaze that night, and even Helios reduced his radiance as Kratos stepped on the mountain. Again the world leaned not in fire, but in breath, a gentle suck before the scream, and even the underworld froze for. Hades knew the tread of feet, and these were weightier than the grave. He ran not, he roared, not he did not call forth blades or storm, merely walked as one with nothing further to prove, nothing further to ask, and all further to conclude. And the ground did not shatter under him, because even the ground knew to bow when a god walks who does not proclaim himself divine, only just. Somewhere far in the far reaches of forgotten places, oracles dreamed in their eyes, open with visions not of prophecy, but of recall memory, not their own yet traveled on their lips like flame on oil. They talked of red, they talked of ash, they talked of winter eyes and iron fists. They talked of the ghost of Sparta, and their voice trembled with awe. And in a world of dream, where times thought Zeus saw what was to be, and knew that this war would not be waged with lightning or law or heritage. It would be waged not by strength, but by tenacity, for what stays longer, the storm in the air or the blaze in the earth? And it began not with war, but with a gasp, the first gasp of a man who died, and lived and died again, and now walk not toward Olympus, but through it, for there is no stopping what must be, but only watching and waiting. And the gods watched, and the earth waited, and the wind whispered a breath. He is coming, Kratos is coming, and at the heart of all that which was old and divine, silence shattered. The mountain remembers the fire. The sky overhead didn't budge. It remained soft and gray, and thick as though the air itself had memory of what took place beneath it some time ago, and would not stir the stillness now. And beneath that heavy, motionless sky, the mountain breathed slow and deep, like some animal that had never really died, but only waited through the long passage of years, and into this ancient breath stepped. Kratos each step, not loud, not proud, just steady like a man who no longer feared. The ascent, but had become the ascent itself. He did not call for the earth to split or the heavens to open. He did not command thunder or flame to accompany his feet, and he did not require the world to take notice of him now, for all he ever required was already in the past, interred in locations he would never revisit in names. He no longer uttered in memories that no longer tormented him. He had become quieter, not softer. He had learned not peace, but the stillness that comes after too many battles, too many losses, too many broken gods. His arms swung loosely at his sides, heavy fingers calloused from centuries of swords. Now open, now at ease, not because there was no war to come, but because the war had changed. The war was not in a blade's swing or a beast. This roar, it was in the breath, between steps in the quiet, between thoughts in the weight of the ascent. And this mountain did not threaten him. It knew him. It remembered the weight of his boots, the crack of his fists, the burning in his chest when he came here before. He traversed trails no longer blazed by fire, but still burned still, resounding with the spirits of gods who once commanded from ivory thrones, now crumbled to dust and wind. And although his footsteps were solitary, the mountain was not deserted, because within its rocks dwelled the memory of each blow, each shriek. Each name that dropped recalled Ares and Poseidon and Helios and Hera. It recalled the evening. The sky grew dark, and it recalled the man who did not plummet with them. Kratos did not glance about. He did not gasp at the vista, or linger at ruins, or reach out to touch the shattered altars left by the forgotten. He had beheld the peak of Olympus prior to having dragged its deities down one at a time till its chambers were crimson with quiet, and the radiance of godliness had flickered and expired. And now he came back not for revenge, not for conquest, but for something more difficult to define, something more weighty, something terminal his chest. Rose and fell in slow, silent cadence, not from fatigue, not yet, but from readiness, from the sort of tranquility that comes to reside in the heart when terror no longer has room there. He wasn't walking towards danger. He was walking towards truth, the type that can't be yelled or hit, but has to be carried the whole way to the edge and set down silently, and the edge was near. He could sense it, not in his bones, but in the quiet of the world, the way the birds had quieted, the wind had gentled, the mountain had stilled. Ahead the trail narrowed between two vertical faces of rock, striped with ash and ancient blood dried. So far into the stone, it had become a part of the mountain as skin, and within those walls, Kratos moved like a shadow back to its source, his eyes ahead, his breath steady and slow, his footsteps quiet. But sure, he walked by a ruined statue of Zeus, the face worn away by time, the eyes long since lost, the hand raised once in warning, now nothing but a stump of forgotten strength. He stopped for a moment, only not to honor, not to hate, merely to remember, and memory no longer stung. It just was heavy and unmoving within his mind. There was a time he would have roared at that statue, torn it down, crushed its bones into the earth. But that time had passed like a storm that had already drowned the land. Now he glanced only once, and then stepped past it, allowing the silence to shut behind him like a door that did not have to be opened anymore. Above him the clouds grew darker. Now denser they hung low and wet, like a sky filled with regret. Not anger, not danger, just sorrow, old and broad and infinite. He did not look up to them. He did not call on the gods to answer, because he already knew. They would not in words, not in signs, not in lightning. Their voices had died long ago, when he ceased to believe, and now the only sound remaining was the constant rhythm of his own footsteps and the breath that never hastened. Zeus stood behind the veil, not sitting, not covered, not crowned, simply watching, simply waiting, simply clinging to the silence, as if it might still provide some sort of shield. The mountain under him shook, not in fear, not in anger, but in recognition, the sort that goes so deep it enters the bones, and the gods who were left did not come. Together they dispersed. They whispered, they concealed themselves, for they too recalled the form of this man and the reality of what he had become. Kratos came to a clearing broad and barren, and still a ring of stone that had once contained prayer and flame, and now contained only dust and echoes. He stood in the middle, aimlessly, without pose, without pride, and the mountain observed him, silently recalling every instant's blood had defiled this ground. He closed his eyes for a breath, just one, just long enough to feel the old heat in the air, the tension that never left the way. Silence held its breath around him. He opened them once more and observed the next trail steep, and ascending abruptly along the ridge, like a gash cut into the earth. He accepted it, without hesitation, without inquiry, without fear, because fear had abandoned him many years before, and only the burden was left, and it was the weight that made him walk steady. Not strength, not speed, not rage, but the quiet, steady burden of everything he had done and everything he could not undo. His mind didn't wander. but it did recall the boy, the way his voice had broken in the chill, the way his questions had cut through stillness like arrows. He recalled the firelight on Freya's face, the melancholy in her voice when she talked of fate, and how the trees murmured when she passed among them. He recalled the silence after battles, when he would sit by himself while the others slept, looking at nothing, hearing the wind as if it would carry a voice he had long since buried. The road was steeper, now the wind colder, the air thin and sharp, but his steps did not slacken, because the climb was not a struggle. It was a sentence, and he had been walking this sentence. Since the day he first picked up a blade and called it justice, he had served gods and killed them. He had sworn oaths and burned cities. He had saved no one, not really. And yet he walked still. He climbed still. He breathed. The mountain did not tremble. It did not cry out. It did not collapse. Because it was not afraid of him. It comprehended him, and that was worse. Zeus moved away from the window and returned to the hall where once the stars inclined at his bidding, and now no echo ventured to follow. His hands did not shake. His face did not alter. But his eyes had grown still in a manner that only happens when the future is no longer subject to your design, and all about him the marble columns remained motionless, expecting what they could not prevent, and the gods he had once addressed as brother and daughter and son were now but shadows. Kratos ascended further where there were no trees, where no animal roamed, where only wind and time and memory had ever lived. He did not turn back, because the past trailed behind him like a shadow that was now a part of his skin. He didn't look up, because he didn't need to see the summit to know. He was close. He walked only one step at a time, allowing the silence to stretch long and wide around him like a pall. And when he reached the last curve in the road where the mountain folded in upon itself and opened into the area where gods waged war and named it law, he paused only long enough to notice the rock under his feet, to feel the weight in his chest, to allow the silence to embrace him for a moment longer. And then he walked on, not like a god, not as a warrior, but as the storm that followed the collapse of faith. When the first whispers of dawn spread across the sky, the battlefield was silent, a heavy stillness falling over the rocky cliffs and jagged peaks where the gods once ruled. The pale light crept slowly, revealing the jagged stones that pierced the horizon like ancient sentinels standing guard over a land worn by time and tempest. Mist hung in the lower valleys, winding through oak and pine like silver ribbons that were caught in the early sun as gentle light. The world seemed to breathe in this moment, a calm pregnant with anticipation, as if nature itself awaited the storm to come. There was no bird song to be heard here, just the soft whisper of icy wind that crept through abandoned ruins and broken columns that spoke of long-forgotten glory and grief. Zeus stood tall, his eyes burning with the fire of countless storms, and the weight of immortality etched deep in the lines of his face. Though eternal, even a god can feel the shadow of doubt creeping close. His powerful frame silhouetted against the waking sky, his hair a wild crown of lightning tendrils that flickered with silent fury. In spite of the divine power that emanated from him, a subtle strain tugged at the borders of his presence like a far-off thunder threatening an imminent storm within. He was the king of Olympus, but here there was no pride, just a profound understanding of what was to come and the price it would exact. Under the shine of immortality, the flame in his eyes danced with remembrances of battles conquered and loved ones lost in a conflict that had extended beyond time itself. Kratos moved slowly, his steps steady like the pounding of ancient drums beneath the earth, his body marked by the scars of endless battles. A warrior forged not in the halls of Olympus, but in the harsh fires of mortal struggle. Every step was purposeful and certain, bearing the weight of pain and resolve borne by a man who had gazed into the abyss and would not turn away. His eyes bore the fierce calm of one who had faced death and returned unbroken, his muscles taut beneath worn armor, etched with the marks of survival and defiance. The air about him appeared to vibrate with silent strength, forged of unbreakable will, and the underlying river of anger that ran just below the surface. Although he was mortal in origin, his soul had been forged by war and tragedy to something beyond mortal limits, something fearsome and unyielding. And yet here he stood face to face with the Lord of the Sky, and thunder a force that appeared unstoppable. And yet Kratos bore with him a fierce determination, bred of pain loss and an unwavering determination to forge his own destiny. A mountain breeze brought the smell of rain and ozone, intermixing with the smell of earth and rock underfoot. About them the debris of old conflicts murmured in the wind, splintered shields and broken armor half submerged in the earth, like lost echoes of an age when gods and mortals warred shoulder to shoulder. Kratos was aware that this was more than a duel. This was the ultimate reckoning, the time when future and past would clash in a storm of thunder and blood. His heart pounded a slow drum of defiance as he steeled himself to confront the storm itself. The air was electric with an unspoken tension that was louder than any thunderbolt. Zeus held up his hand, and the skies grew dark, his voice booming across the mountain like the far-off rumble of an oncoming storm. Clouds massed in dense churning billows like mighty animals, stirring from sleep, their borders faintly luminous with the sheer power of the divine. The very atmosphere seemed charged, humming with electricity that made the hairs on skin stand on end. The mountain itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the moment, the ancient stones vibrating as if anticipating the violence to come. Zeus's voice echoed deep and commanding, cutting through the silence like the toll of a war bell heralding the clash of titans. You dare confront me, mortal? The very lifeblood of conflict that runs through your veins is but a spark compared to the infinite darkness of my rule. They were a warning and a challenge, as well as statement of sovereignty that reached back to the beginning of time. He was the storm incarnate, the master of skies and thunder, whose fury could tear mountains asunder and drown cities in floods. But under the strength was a begrudging respect for the mortal who had the temerity to challenge him, acknowledgement of the flame that burned in Kratos. Sighs. This was not an ordinary challenger, but a power forged in the fiercest crucible, a warrior who would not be broken under the heel of gods. Kratos did not flinch, for his eyes held a quiet fire, not of arrogance, but of hardened truth. They burned with the constant flame of a person who had experienced suffering and allowed it to kindle an unbreakable spirit. His voice, when it finally came, was serene, but had the power of a mountain river, cutting through rock with inexorable patience. I am no mere mortal, he said. My blood carries the fury of war, and my soul is forged in defiance. There was no doubt in his words, only the certainty of a man who had made peace with his own destiny and would face whatever came without fear. Time lagged as the two men looked into one another, a moment suspended between eternity and man's fleeting breath. The mountain beneath them groaned, as though earth itself braced for the oncoming storm, but neither moved yet for words. Were the first arms employed in a struggle which would shake the world as foundation? Around them the sky held its breath, the clouds immobile like statues on the brink of explosion. The air was charged with expectation, every leaf, every stone, every whisper of breeze, a silent witness to the weight of what was to come. In that frozen instant, past and future were at war, and the fate of men and gods hung in the balance. Kratos spoke, and his voice low and level. The gods have ruled for far too long, while men bleed and weep. His words a chanted vow, a vow torn from fire and suffering that echoed through the hollow air. I will break their shackles and build a new world, one in which will and power shape the earth and heavens, and not the whim of Olympus. He remained unshaking and unbending, a storm of human defiance, standing before the immortal monarch, with no more than his resolve and war swords. Zeus laughed, a sound equally horrifying and pervertedly funereal. You speak of fetters, but you have forgotten who forged them out. His laughter thundered, mixing grief and scorn, a reminder of the divine hand that had forged the world into existence. I breathed life into you, and invested you with power of the wind that ignites your wrath. Do you not know that to oppose me is to oppose yourself? The weight of his words carried the burdens of countless centuries, the unbreakable chains of fate, hammered into shape in creation's crucibles. But behind the godlike conceit, there was a faint shiver of doubt, a fear of the unknown, and the unbreakable will defying his throne. Kratos pounded his fists, his voice booming like a tempest. You made me suffer and sorrow, but never gave me my soul. His declaration was one of choice, a breaking of ethereal shackles forged by gods and destiny. Both I will decide what I am, not you, not the gods nor destiny. The commanding force in his voice broke the silence like thunder and bore promise of a new dawn after the former manner of things. The skies were torn asunder as Zeus summoned a tempest with lightning, snapping the air, and thunder, shaking the mountains themselves. Dark clouds whirled in demented spirals, releasing bolts of untempered power that flayed the ground and shattered rock. The skies became a howling tempest, a furious clamor of fury and power unleashed by the king of gods himself. But Kratos did not waver, his body attuned to withstand the fury. That would emanate like the crash of Titans' cries of wars of yore, echoing through the ages. His ground unmoving, a living fortress, forged in pain and battle, poised to ride out the storm and craft his fate with iron will and strength. It was no longer just a fight. It was a reckoning, a convergence of divine and human entwined, and a conclusion unknown even to the stars themselves. The atmosphere was thick with magic and ancient power, the very essence of reality distorting to the power of their combat. With every strike, with every step vibrating out through the universe, to create shockwaves through time and space. In this divine conflict, the heavens trembled and the earth did, struggle bearing witness to a conflict that would frame all of existence. And yet, in the midst of the storm, there was a strange calm, a quiet river of resolve flowing beneath the tempest. For as Zeus hurled his first lightning, Kratos moved with the stealth of the hunted and the power of the unconquerable. His sword sang war's hymn, an older waltz than time itself, threading through lightning and thunder with killing intent. Each strike met the thunder head-on with defiance, and rage his war shouts muffled by the storm. His cry and yet a peace built inside him like a mighty river that flowed beneath the chaos. His mind sharp and keen, a knife cutting through the rage focused on the end alone he could see. Their fight carried them from the loftiest peaks to the darkest, valleys from lightning-torn cliffs to shadowed glades where trees older than history sang forgotten secrets. They fought like myth made real shadows and light, weaving a tapestry of war across the wild landscape. The very air appeared to shiver with the heat of their battle magic and history, flowing with every blow. Around them, the world retained its breath that was drawn in the endless dance of gods and men struggling under the keen eye of abandoned gods. Kratos remembered the faces of the people who were gone from him, the burden of each fight and each betrayal, and it sustained his resolve. Recollections, specter-like, drifted inside his head, names and voices which had led him and driven him mad. For this was no merely fight for control. This was fight for meaning, for liberation from the yokes of gods and fate both. Every strike he landed was a promise and an invitation to those who trembled at his feet and to the fate he dared to shape. Zeus himself felt the tide shifting the mortal, no mere contender, but a force as wild and elemental as the storms he commanded. The fire that burned within Kratos was a mirror of the divine struggle to which even a god is prone within his own chest. A struggle not just of might, but of will and spirit, the eternal battle between order and chaos. The eyes of Zeus flashed with a dash of fear and admiration as the battle went on, a dance older than time itself, repeated once again. The war resounded with lightning echoes and steel thunder and rage, every moment heavier with the promise of its ending. Neither gave nor the war was not yet done. The gods watched silently from their hidden positions. The world itself quivered under the weight of their war, the world's bones cracking under the strain. And still the battle seethed, a conflagration blazing where gods and mortals wrestled in a ritual as old as time. The sun dipped low, and shadows stretched as night readied to claim the heavens. Night clung to the mountain in its cold arms, but the battle raged hotter than before. Flickers of lightning illuminated the roiling tempest like ghosts of war battling in the firmament. And so the story unfolds, slow and gently embracing you deeper into the bosom of legend, where the final battle between Zeus and Kratos has only just set a tale that will echo through eternities. As the stormy darkness raged above, the wind wailed between broken columns and rent stone, carrying on its breath the sense of smoke and ancient blood. The battlefield was suspended in time, every gust that blew through the ruins like the breath of the sleeping monster stirring before the ultimate awakening. Clouds churned in a frenzied vortex above the mountain summit, consuming stars, one by one in their fury, until there was only darkness lit by the pulse of lightning in the skies. Zeus hovered above the broken earth, his cloak of storm churning around him in tendrils of electrical flame, his eyes blazing like twin suns in eclipse. Each word he spoke echoed like thunder across the peaks, shaking dust from forgotten temples and awakening sleeping echoes from the womb of the earth. I am Olympus, I am the breath of sky, and storm the bones of mountains, the roar of waves on every shore. His voice was not a sound, but a pressure upon the very stuff of the world, bending time and wind with its old imperative. Kratos did not rise to meet the braggart's words. Instead, he stood motionless, his blades dripping sparks as they pulsed in rhythm with his heart. There was no fear in his eyes, but silence slow and ponderous, as glaciers grinding mountains into dust. In that silence were memories deep as wounds, names spoken by the dead, hopes reduced to ashes in time and still burning inside. Him like an ember that refused to die. The two men stood there opposite each other amidst the ruin of an old world and the beginning of a new. With a single swift movement, Zeus stretched out his arm, and lightning roared from the heavens and struck the earth, like a hammer from the gods, splitting the earth in two. The light surrounded Kratos with white fire, but he was untouched, his form black against the flames. His muscles coiled like a lion, preparing to pounce. The ground tore apart with each step. He took forward, rock growling beneath his feet, as if resistant to the will that now walked upon it. Zeus called again to the skies, and a dozen bolts fell like fingers of a vengeful deity, but Kratos deflected each with the smooth, deadly efficiency of a storm-hardened blade. He was no longer the man broken by sorrow, no longer the god haunted by his past. He was determination, made flesh-pain distilled to resolve vengeance purified by the centuries. Their swords met in a crash that tore the quiet from the world. Steel met thunder, and flame met storm, and where they struck the earth tore apart, revealing rivers of liquid gold that pulsed like veins beneath the world. Every blow they exchanged echoed through the valleys beneath, causing birds to fall from trees and shaking the rocks in distant temples. Every hit a prayer unspoken, every step a line in the hymn of combat. Written by sword and lightning and rage, Kratos attacked with both blades, claiming the light of the storm as they cut swaths through the air. Zeus fought back with blasts of power drawn from the skies themselves, shaping wind into walls and rain into spears. But Kratos pressed forward, relentless his fury, a tide that broke every defense and surged over the aged god like the ocean reclaiming its shores that were lost. Lightning struck the summit of a distant mountain, casting it into fire. The flames danced like a beacon, but neither fighter had their focus set exclusively on the other. The world around them condensed to sound and fury. As the battle raged on, time itself began to lose its meaning. The stars traveled overhead the sky, slowing as if watching the combat in horror or awe. The moon trembled behind its veil of clouds, casting a dim light upon a landscape that had become a temple of war. Kratos struck low, slicing through the air with the wrath of 1,000 lifetimes. Zeus deflected, but stumbled backwards as stone crumbled beneath his heel. He called down lightning into his palms and hurled it with a scream that tore the skies, but Kratos leaped through the blast blades. outstretched in defiance of fate. Their forms collided in a burst of white fire brighter than the sun. When the flash passed, both stood still, once more breathing not from exertion, but from the sheer mass of what was unfolding. Kratos bled from a superficial slash down his side, but his grip didn't falter. Zeus's shoulders shook, his face darkened by strain, and something older, something very much like doubt. "Do you not see, god of war?" Zeus said, his voice now lower, the distant rumble of receding thunder. "The world you would build with your rage will burn as mine once did before it. You fight to be free, but freedom brings chaos, without order without. Olympus, there is nothing but destruction." Kratos breathed the smoke-filled air and spoke, "Then let there be destruction. If destruction is the price of truth, if chaos is the fire that forges off the chains, then let the fire come. I will bring down all the false thrones. I will silence every voice that falsely claims to rule." What they did not bleed, for Zeus raised his hand again, but his movement was slower, more labored, as if the storm within him had begun to recede. He looked at Kratos and did not see a man, not even a god, but something older, a truth that could not be chained or broken only. Faced and endured, the storm above them broke open, and a final bolt of lightning came down between them, splitting the earth and shaking all the corners of the world. Their swords clashed repeatedly, fire and air swirling around them. They danced like ritual dancers in a ritual not of celebration, but of sacrifice. With each pass they traded pain for pain and memory for memory. They were not battling to conquer, they were battling to conclude. And as they circled one another beneath the broken sky, the mountain trembled once more. There was a mighty scream from the rocks, a noise not made by man or God, but by the earth itself, bearing witness to the moment history bent. Then the storm broke. The clouds split open, and the rain came down in sheets, washing blood from stone and fire from earth. Zeus staggered, lightning flashing from his fingertips, but fading. Kratos raised his blades, their edges shining with the first light of morning, as the sky began to change. The dawn crept slow and steady, cutting through the destruction of the night. The fires in the sky faded to orange and gold. The mountain was quiet now, the earth steaming, the air thick with silence. Kratos stood alone, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths. The war in his eyes still burning, but at bay. He looked out to the horizon where the sun now slowly rose. Behind him, Zeus was quiet, his body still, his eyes closed, not in defeat, but realization. The gods looked on from the lofty halls of forgotten worlds and whispered, for, in that instant, the cycle had turned. The war was not ended, but it had changed. Kratos spoke not again, as he departed, his form consumed by the fog and the morning sun. Each step left no mark, each breath drew the air, and the mountain remained witness to a final fact. Even deities must yield to the will of those who refuse to kneel. So let the tempest now recede. Let your breath diminish. Let your mind slowly creep along this myth born not just of fire and thunder, but of choice and freedom. For the conflict of Zeus and Kratos was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of something old, a quiet strength, born not in storms, but in stillness. The ghost of Sparta, echoes of a mortal past, when the fire of war burned down to ash and silence. The ghost of Sparta strode once more through the lands that gave him birth, not in glory or in welcome, but in remembrance and solemnity. The wind, once fraught with divine wrath and thunderous verdict, now whispered soft and low, tugging at the edges of his cloak like unseen fingers, like ghosts summoning him homeward. Not a home of warmth, nor comfort, nor security, but a home of stone and wound. A home built upon silence, upon obligation, upon blood spilled not for honor, but for expectation. The road ahead of him was a ghost trail, itself broken and deserted, overgrown with weeds that clawed their way through the wounds of earth like the persistence of time. Every rock he passed bore silent testament to the boy he once was. With each step, dust devils swirled in tiny tornadoes, as if memories had been awakened from sleep. The sun was setting on the horizon, and the shadows it conjured did not attend him, but stood guard, waited for him, whispered in his ear alone. This was Sparta. Not the Sparta of myth and song, not the city of scroll-marked honor and statue whisper. No, this was the true Sparta, the one written in the flesh of its sons, the one that shaped Kratos not into a hero, but a weapon. It was not the city the world recalled, but the one he recalled. In blood, in fire, he walked with the weight of a man who carried more than arms. He carried centuries of silence, the silence of those who were never afforded the opportunity to cry, the silence of the vanquished who had been commanded to battle yet again, the silence of boys made into tools and men made into beasts. The scent of old smoke lingered in the air, a memory that would not fade. It clung to the debris, to the earth, to the foundations of the city itself. There were no noises here, no cries of war, no drills, no clash of shields or shout of officers, just silence, just devastation. There was nothing but the sound of a single man returning, not as a soldier, not as a god, but as a reckoning. He moved beneath the arch of a broken gate where he had stood tall and proud, a young warrior with fire in his heart and chains as yet unfelt. The training grounds beyond were no longer grounds. They were fields of dust and dry bone. The sand that had swallowed sweat and blood was long since dust. The pillars that had been thick with shouting men and barked orders were now broken like old spears, their silence more honest than any memory. And yet, in the stillness of dusk he heard it, not with his ears, but deeper. The snap of wooden swords, the crunch of bone, the screams gulped before they could turn to sobs. The breath of children trained to kill before they learned to dream. Kratos closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, the past stirred, and he saw himself, young, stubborn, his fists battered and scarred, not in triumph, but in the fight to live, not in pride, but in survival. A hunger not for name or honor, but for freedom, from pain, from weakness, from fear, from Sparta. But what he became, what he truly became, was not made there, not entirely. Its roots began in that field, but the tree twisted, gnarled, and resilient grew from the ash of what came after. He walked away from the field and deeper into the city. The alleys narrowed around him like a closing mouth. Shadows seeped from cracks in the rock, stretching across the path like fingers of a long-forgotten past. He knew these paths, every step, every turn, but now they were distant like a memory of a dream, softened by time and fire. He passed a wall where he once carved his name. It was gone now, consumed by moss, worn by rain, remembered no more. Even his scars could vanish from stone. He arrived at a small clearing where the house once stood. The house that had a family, that had peace, that had him, if only for a fleeting moment in time. The wood had vanished, but its form remained in the earth. The entrance still breathed memory. He stood before it, and the silence deepened. Here, Lysandra had waited. Her eyes were still as stagnant water. Her voice was soft, but it sliced through the turmoil like light in a storm. She had not gazed at a god, nor at a warrior. She had gazed at a man, and had loved him despite the storm in his eyes. And here too, his daughter had laughed. Her laughter had filled the house, like dawn light filling a room. She would run to him with arms uplifted, and for those few seconds, the world had been whole. Kratos stepped into the doorway of that house, and he knelt, not in prayer, not in sorrow, but in remembrance. He did not cry. Tears were not the currency of his pain, but the quiet inside him shouted louder than any scream. It echoed off the broken walls and up to the stars in the sky. He unwound the chains from his back. The blades, so familiar, so cruel, fell to the ground with a finality that rang through the earth. They glowed softly, like eyes awakening in the dark. They were not just weapons. They were mirrors, and in them he saw every scream unanswered, every choice unmade, every moment he could not take back. He gazed at them not with love, nor with hate, but with truth. These swords were a part of him, not since he chose them, but since they were forged in the same fire that forged him. He would carry them still, not to slay, not to conquer, but to remember, to never forget the man behind the monster, the father behind the fury, the boy behind the swords. He rose slowly and turned towards the mountains outside the city. There, at the edge of sight, was the temple of Ares, once proud, now fallen, its altar shattered, its statue overthrown, a god brought low by the hand he himself had created. Kratos moved along the path with quiet resolve. Each step was a statement. Each breath was rebellion. He stood before the shattered image of Ares, whose face looked upwards as if still calling for mastery. Kratos placed his hand on the cold marble, and he whispered, not to Ares, but to the child he once was, to the man who once believed, I see you, I carry you, but you do not own me. The statue cracked again, not from force, but from truth. And with that, he turned away, not victorious, but whole. The wind stirred again, not with cries of battle, but with quiet, with peace, with memory. He left no prince behind him, but the path was made, clear, unmistakable, for Sparta had listened. And now, at last, the ghost of Sparta could walk on not in darkness, but in light. So now, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts disperse like leaves across the old stones of a shattered city. Let the silence speak its secrets, and hear the story still being spoken. You have walked with him, seen the man behind the legend, and now he walks on. The story continues. Ashes of vengeance, rise of the mortal god beneath a copper-hued sky pregnant with dusk. Kratos walked along the edges of broken Sparta, his figure cutting a jagged silhouette against the dying light as he disappeared into the soil that had long flowed red beneath his tyranny. The highways were empty, though once they were not. In ancient days, those same roads had resounded under Spartan legions. His legions shod hooves on ground in one cry of conquest and devotion. Now, no dust blew on every step, and the ground lay vacant, empty of glory, empty of sense. Yet Kratos did not want glory. No more. Kratos wanted nothing but memory, not because he cherished memory, but because memory demanded accounting. Even the gods themselves, and most particularly the mortal-born gods, will someday have to return to the fires that forged them. The ground he trod no longer had a name in the songs of Olympus. They were not sacred lands. They were lost on the periphery of a world seared black with ambition, where villages once stood tall, and afterwards were reduced by the same hand that now made its way unseen through their ashes. Here, once, had stood the village of Gythius, the first to perish when Sparta answered the call to war. Here, once, had he worn the blades of chaos and committed atrocities against the innocent in the name of obedience, believing that to be a servant of Ares was to be strong and that strength was freedom. But he knew better now. Purposeless power had left behind only ghosts, and the burdens that he had borne had never truly snapped, only driven further into the skin. He stood before a ruin barely more distinct than the wilderness that engulfed it, overrun and half consumed by ivy and silence. It had once been a temple, modest and small, where villagers worshipped not war gods or thunder gods, but hearth and harvest lesser deities, forgotten centuries ago by Olympus, but very much beloved by the people who needed them. Kratos stepped across the entrance where no priest or devotee had walked in centuries. The air was softly dusty and cypress-scented, but underneath lurked something older, an unhissed yet known memory, like an old lullaby once heard in a dream. The altar had cracked, its gifts having long since fallen to dust, But he still knelt before it, not praying, but in silence. In the quiet, he could almost hear the faint whispering of an ancient priestess, her voice trembling as she prayed for rain to preserve the harvest, or health to cure a dying child. He remembered how such pleas never reached Olympus. He had seen with his own eyes that the gods would not listen unless the voice was accompanied by blood, unless the cry was spoken in agony. And yet here, in this forgotten shrine, something stirred in him, not divine, but intensely human. A knowing, a sorrow, a truth the gods could not deny, that it was the mortal heart that paid the cost of all divine sport. He rose to his feet without a word and continued. Night fell slowly, not like drawn folds, but like ink spreading across vellum, flowing into all the margins until there was only darkness. Kratos lit no fire as he traveled. He needed none. The remembrance flamed hot enough. Before the shores of Laconia, where sea pounded upon razor rock in unending rhythm, he halted. Before him lay the Aegean, cruel and vast, its face marked in moonlight. Here, years passed, the ships had departed. Warships with his name, his banner, his unrelenting fury. He had stood on these bluffs and watched them vanish beyond the horizon, sails full of wind and hubris, bound for victories that would make the map crimson. Now he stood no longer as captain, but as convict, condemned by memory to relive every departure. The battle with the barbarians, the battle that would end in despair, the final plea to Ares to have mercy. It was here that the tide of his heart changed for the first time. It was here that the war god responded to the plea of a dying soldier, not with mercy, but with chains. And it was here that Kratos learned that the blessing of every god is rewarded by a knife in the back. He closed his eyes, and the wind wailed through canyons below, with the reek of salt and something else ash. Ash of his wife, his child, the wound they had left on him, branded always to his flesh as curse and warning. That sorrow, that guilt, that undying mourning had not weakened him, had reshaped him. For every step since, each enemy slain, each god defied, each battle none for revenge alone. They were for atonement, a crusade not to wipe the slate clean, but to carry it in honesty and heft, that it might never be done again. When he walked away from the cliffs, there stood before him a person out of the darkness, not physical, but memory made flesh. Ares, red-eyed and tall, the mad god of his earlier life, grinning with the fire of ruin. Kratos did not draw his swords. He just looked, and the vision disappeared, like a wicked dream dissolved by the dawn. There was no power remaining in that blackness. There was only the truth left. Kratos had once been a slave, but no longer obeyed. He once kneeled, but no longer bowed. The chains Ares himself had forged would now only move at Kratos' whim. That was the difference. That was the ash-forged way. He walked once more until dawn, painted the sky in soft hues of bronze and lavender to reveal him a plain where a small village had stood. Argolis, a peaceful farming village, once under the banner of Sparta's standard, until war demanded sacrifice. He himself had ordered it, not to destroy, but to make an example. He had not seen the smoke of the huts, but he had heard the stories. And now he was standing where the stories began, and the quiet was more than any scream. He walked through the ruin, boots kicking broken clay, past hearthstones where the family meals were shared, now blackened with ash. There was no shrine here, no statue, no divine pronouncement, only the silent retribution of time and truth. And that was enough. He bent alongside the ruins of a child's toy half-grave in dirt, splintered with decades, but still bearing the mark of a loving touch. He did not move it. He did not need to. The weight rested on him like the sea. He sat on a decaying wall, hands on knees, steady breaths. Not because the past had liberated him, but because he had remained in it, unblinking. And in remaining, he found something that even the gods feared sometimes. Acceptance, not forgiveness. Not peace, but the indubitable view that comes when there is nothing left to hide. He was a monster, a murderer, a god, a father, a man. He was all these, and none of them exclusively. The sum of war and love and failure and strength. And as the morning drew slow over the hills, and birds cried not for Kratos but for morning, Kratos rose once more, not with triumph or regret, but with a gentle resolve that pulsed deeper than any battle roar. He averted his gaze from the devastation and proceeded, for onward was the sole direction remaining, and the road was not yet finished. So now let the earth claim what was lost. Let the winds recall. Let the sun rise without shame, for even in the embers of revenge, something still lingered. Not hope not yet, but something akin. Something created not by gods, but by the will to live. And as you close your eyes and fall deeper into myth's silent throng, remember this: there is power in returning, not to reclaim what was taken, but to understand what it cost. For the man once called the ghost of Sparta does not march now for vengeance, but for the truth he draws with every breath. And the story continues. The sun loomed low and ominous in the skies, casting long shadows that stretched out endlessly across the battle-weary lands. This was a land forged in centuries of blood and flame, where the songs of war still obstinately clung to the dry stones and barren earth, as though the ghosts of fallen warriors would not depart, lingering like a thick fog that no breeze might dispel. Kratos walked steadily on through the rocky terrain, his boots kicking up clouds of dust that rose like silent phantoms from forgotten battlefields. Each grain of sand, each splinter of shattered stone, was a silent witness to the countless lives, surrendered to the countless cries swallowed by the winds. The burden of history weighed upon him, not as a burden, but as a solemn reminder of the path he had walked, the lives he had ruined, and the fate he had yet to claim. The ruins of Sparta stretched out before him, shattered and still, but alive with the memory of what once was. No cries of triumph rang out across the air, no clang of swords or tread of marching feet, only a dull hush hung heavy over the devastated city, a silence so intense it seemed to live with its own grief. The fallen statues' fractured columns and splintered walls whispered their stories to the wind, telling of glory lost to ashes of empires forged in fire and interred beneath the dust of centuries. Kratos walked among these remnants of a world long dead, feeling the coarse grain of ancient stones beneath his fingers as he walked. Each step stirred strata of history, rousing the ghosts of the past that stood to meet him, their voices a chorus of suffering and sorrow borne on the air. The scent of dry, cracked earth mixed subtly with the bitter tang of ash, lingering reminders of past conflagrations. Beyond the distant hills, the sea softly murmured its waves, gently lapping at the shore, as if in mourning the blood tides that had once washed over these lands. Kratos' thoughts turned to the lives shaped in this endless conflict, the comrades who'd fallen alongside him, the innocents caught in the merciless crossfire, and the family he'd lost in the carnage. Each memory burned like a flame within him, bright and consuming, fueling a fierce determination that no passing year or cruel fate could extinguish. In this quiet moment, the ghost of Sparta was not a monster of rage and destruction. He was a man seeking something far more elusive, a chance to redeem the years of pain, a hope that somewhere beyond the ashes there could still be peace. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with brushes of gold and red, Kratos approached the ruins of a temple that had once stood tall and unyielding, a shrine to Ares, god of war. Now the temple lay in ruins, its broken columns stretching up towards the light, like splintered bones darkening against the dying light. The altar was split and bare, its carved reliefs worn smooth by the constant wearing of time and weather. Here in this place once holy to blood and strife, the stones themselves seemed to mourn the lost devotion and shattered oaths of mortals who had come seeking strength in gods and found despair. Ruin of the temple was a testament not only to the destruction of a city, but to the transience of faith itself. How easily it could be shattered by the harsh realities of war and grief. Kratos stood before the temple's broken threshold, his eyes dwelling on the jagged stone edges and the vacant spaces where statues had stood watch. The weight of the years pressed down upon him as memories surged forth, memories of betrayal that had rent his heart asunder, victories, hollow and bittersweet, and the never-ending struggle to wrest control from the merciless hands of fate and divine tyranny. His blades hung silent across his back, their cold steel no longer, simply tools of devastation, but symbols of survival strength and the unbreakable determination to persevere. Each scar on his flesh had its tale, every mark on his soul, a testament to wars fought, not simply against enemies, but against the darkness within himself. The wind whipped up, suddenly stirring dust and dry leaves into a whirling dervish around him, carrying on its breath a haunting melody, an ancient lament, soft and mournful, rising from the very rocks at his feet. It was a song of loss and longing, a distant echo of voices silenced by time and fate, their stories half forgotten and half remembered. Kratos closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and let the tide of memories break over him like an unstoppable wave. Through the veil, he saw her, the face of Lysandra, serene and determined, her eyes burning with a quiet determination that had long ago anchored him in the eye of the hurricane. Her image, though, no, but a memory, was a shining beacon in the darkness, a guttering flame illuminating his path through the storm of his own making. Yet the past was no sanctuary. Kratos was a battleground, where wounds still burned and shadows lurked at every corner of his mind. The ghosts of mistake and lost life whispered unceasingly, their voices a constant murmur of anguish and regret. But in their haunting was also a brutal clarity of fire that burned away doubt and fear, illuminating a path through the night. Kratos knew that the war he waged was not only against gods and enemies, but against the chains his own guilt and desire for vengeance had created. To break those chains, he must face the shadows within, embracing the pain not as something to be shielded from, but as the fire in which his highest strength was forged. The sky grew dark into dusk, the last vestiges of daylight resolving to a soft indigo, and the stars began to bloom like ancient sentinels, silent and eternal. Kratos turned away from the ruined temple and resumed his journey through the labyrinth of broken streets and silent stones. The road in front of him was uncertain, filled with danger and the promise of battles yet to be won, but he moved with a renewed sense of direction. No longer a force of destruction, he was a force that would forge a new destiny out of the wreckage of a shattered world. The ghosts of Sparta accompanied him like a dying refrain, a solemn reminder of where he had come from and of the price he would pay for the tomorrow he dared to dream. Night fell fully now, covering the world in a cloak of darkness, dotted with sparkling stars. The air was still and silent, broken only by the distant cry of a lone owl and the soft rustle of leaves unsettled by a gentle breeze in the distance. A wolf howled a mournful cry that seemed to call forth the very essence of the land. Kratos moved silently, a shadow among shadows his mind, a tempest under his calm exterior. He was both the product of Sparta's violent tradition and the creator of a new fate, walking the narrow path between past and future. The world held its breath, poised in the delicate balance between destruction and salvation, war and peace, despair and hope. And in this fragile moment, the ghost of Sparta was no longer just a name whispered in fear. He was the living embodiment of an eternal truth, one as old as time itself, that even from the ruins of destruction, life could endure. Even in the depths of overwhelming darkness, the spark of resilience could be fanned into flame, illuminating a path forward through darkness and silence. Kratos was no longer just a god of war or a ghost of bloody legend. He was a man reborn in the fire of memory and choice, walking quietly into the unknown with a heart tempered in pain and a soul of fire with the hope of redemption. The night stretched out wide and endless above the shattered earth, where the whispers of ancient wars moaned through the cold air like restless spirits. Kratos stood alone beneath a starless sky, as if the heavens themselves had turned their face from the world below. His breath created consistent mist that mingled with the mist, weaving about shattered stones and fallen pillars, the remnants of a long-lost greatness swallowed by darkness. The Sparta ruins were still around him, but vibrant with the memories of 1,000 lifetimes in the wind that now swirled gently soft as it moved through the broken ground and tangled vines, appeared to carry stories of sorrow and of strength that were woven together like threads in a tapestry created by time itself. The great city that had forged warriors from boys and legends from pain now existed only in fragments, in whispers, and in the heavy, leaden feeling of history that settled deep within Kratos' heart. He moved slowly along the deserted streets, his footsteps stirring echoes of the past, each step a quiet prayer, an offering to those who had been consumed by the wars that had been fought, and to the hope that had endured despite all. The air was thick with the scent of moss and old stone, a scent that bore witness to resilience and decay, and to the delicate balance between them. In this city where gods had once walked among men, now there were just shadows that danced barely out of reach of light and memory. Kratos reached a clearing where the remnants of an ancient altar, cracked and worn by countless seasons, stood. Here he knelt and placed his hands on the cold surface, feeling the rough texture like the pulse of the earth itself beneath his fingers. In that moment, the years of anger, sorrow, and guilt seemed to collapse into silence, a silence that sounded louder than any shriek. The ghosts of those he had loved and lost seemed to close in around him, not as tormentors, but as silent witnesses to a path not yet ended, but transformed. The sky lightened at the edges, heralding the dawn's gradual approach. The first pale rays of light crept their way along the horizon, throwing the ruins into hues of rose and pale gold. The chill of the night began to fade, replaced by a gentle warmth that appeared to seep into the stones themselves and into the heart of the man who had once been a god and a ghost, and was now something more, something complete and human. Kratos rose and turned his gaze to the distant mountains, their rocky summits outlined against the morning sky like silent sentinels guarding the secrets of a forgotten time. He carried the weight of his past like chains that had been broken, but the scars remained as reminders of what had been endured and what had been overcome. The path ahead was veiled in doubt and menaced with peril, but it was a path he chose to walk, not as a tool of revenge, but as a vessel of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and redemption. As he walked away from the wreckage, the wind returned with the faintest whisper of a melody of rebirth and renewal, a melody that spoke of endings and beginnings being intertwined like the turning of the seasons and the eternal cycle of life and death. The world around him breathed with the quiet strength of those who will not be remembered and those who will be reborn. The stars above shone softly like watchful eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires, the despairs and hopes of gods and men. They stood witness now to a man who no longer thirsted for vengeance or glory, but who sought to reclaim the fragments of a broken past, to heal the wounds that ran deeper than flesh and steel. The night enfolded him like a cloak, yet in its darkness there was a light, a gentle glow ignited not by flame, but by something more durable. The vision of Lysandra remained with him like a gentle flame that would not be extinguished. Her face serene, her spirit unbroken. She was the anchor in the storm, the whisper of peace in a world torn apart by war. Kratos carried her with him as he carried all loss, all pain, all wisdom acquired in the black and lonely hours of his journey. Her memory was a balm and a burden, a reminder of what was lost and what remained to fight for. With each step the weight of his blades lightened, not because the violence was finished, but because their meaning had changed. They were no longer merely tools of destruction, but symbols of endurance and choice, a reminder that even the darkest paths could reach morning, that the man who wielded them was not defined by the wars he fought, but by the strength to leave them behind when the time arose. The ruins of Sparta whispered secrets in the language of stone and shadow. They told of glory and ruin, of faith shattered and hope reborn, of the endless dance between life and death. The earth beneath his feet was a living memory, a mosaic of suffering and triumph that stretched beyond the limits of time and myth. Kratos was a piece of that mosaic, a fragment of a tale still being woven, a legacy forged in the fire of his own making. As the lightened horizon beckoned, the first birds began their morning song, their voices, faint but insistent, rising through the stillness like a promise. The world was waking anew, and so was he no longer the angry ghost of a fallen past, but a man reborn in the quiet crucible of reflection and resolve, ready to face whatever dawn might bring, with a heart tempered by sorrow and a spirit unbroken. So now as you listen, let your breath slow and your mind float easily on the winds of this tale. Let the silence wrap around you like a cloak, and the echoes of Sparta carry you deeper into a world where even gods must reconcile with the past, and where the fiercest battles are those fought within. Sleep now in this stillness with the knowledge that the path is far from over, but that each step taken is a victory, each second of peace, a triumph over the storms that beset us all. And when you awaken, take with you the quiet strength of the ghost of Sparta, a strength not forged in anger, nor in fury, but in resilience, redemption, and the stubborn hope that even from ashes we can rise anew. For now, the book shuts on this chapter of the story, a story not just of war and vengeance, but of healing and choice. The ghost of Sparta walks not into darkness, but toward a dawn lit by the promise of rebirth and the unspoken truth that even gods and mortals alike must find their own way to peace. This is not an ending, but a beginning, a silent shifting of the tide where the hardest battles may be waged not with the sword, but with the courage to forgive, to remember, and to stand again. And as the morning light first breaks over the land, so too does hope rise up within us all, a small flame burning steady and bright. Amidst the silence, a reminder that no matter the duration of night, no matter the violence of the storm, there is always a way forward, always a possibility of forgiveness, always a whisper of peace just over the horizon. So rest now and breathe deeply in the knowledge that the story continues from this moment, beyond the rise and fall of empires and the war of gods. The journey of the ghost of Sparta, as the journey within each of us, is a tale yet being told aflame, yet burning of force, yet growing in the endless struggle between shadow and light. Ashes of vengeance, the rise of the mortal god, the quiet before the storm. The sky gaped wide and merciless above the shattered earth, where twilight faded slowly into the gathering night, projecting shadows that stretched long and twisted across the broken ground. Kratos marched on, relentless and unyielding his footfalls, stirring up ancient dust from battlefields long past each grain, a silent witness to centuries of strife, sacrifice, and carnage. A heaviness settled thick in the air, the burden of history pressing deep into soul and bone. But his face was calm, expressionless, carved from years of pain, loss, and unbreakable, while his gaze set on the jagged mountains that loomed like dark sentinels against the dying light. The Sparta ruins whispered soundlessly around him in the language of crumbled stone and toppled pillars, cracked walls and scattered ash. These were not merely ruins, but the remains of a city that had lived and died by the sword, a city born of blood and myth, where gods had strolled among men and mortals had challenged the heavens. The earth itself seemed to pulse with memory, agony, and triumph, braided like threads in a tapestry woven by the gods themselves. Kratos felt that pulse deep in his chest, a slow, steady rhythm beating with the power of 1,000 lives and battles that had shaped his own fate. His thoughts turned to the gods and the powers they wielded. Zeus, king of Olympus, whose thunder rolled like a storm across the skies. A god creator and destroyer, who ordered with a voice that could shatter mountains and bid the winds obey. The memory of their last conflict burned in Kratos' mind, the furious storm of lightning, and steel, a dance of rage and will, where neither had yielded and both had been marked by the fury loosed. Their struggle was not one of mere force, but a struggle of ideals. Order versus chaos, destiny versus defiance. Zeus towered a figure carved from the very storm, his eyes burning with the cold fire of divine power. His presence was awe and terror, a reminder that gods ruled not only the earth, but fate itself. Yet Kratos harbored within him a defiance no god could shatter, a flame ignited by torment and loss that would not be extinguished. His blades hung heavy on his back, their frozen weight a reminder of the wars fought and the vengeance sought. But now those arms were more than tools of death. They were emblems of a will that had been tested by gods and monsters, alike forged in the fire of endless conflict and honed by the desire to take back what had been stolen from him: honor, family, peace. The scars that etched his flesh and soul were the map of a journey marked by torment, sacrifice, and the single-minded quest for freedom. The wind suddenly kicked up, whipping dust and dry leaves into a frenzied dance that carried on it a haunting melody, older than memory and older yet than the gods themselves. A lament of loss, longing, and survival, emanating from the rocks at his feet, whispering of promises betrayed and compacts ancient. The song did not speak to Kratos as a warning, but rather as a summons calling him back through the corridors of time to where the line between mortal and god had vanished, and fate had been written in blood and fire. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him like a wave. The vision of Lysandra took shape softly in his mind, her eyes steady, her spirit unbroken, a beacon in the storm of his past. Her memory remained with him like a small fire that was never quite extinguished, a reminder of love and hope, trapped in the endless storm of war and vengeance. She was the light that had once anchored him, a fragile thread strung through the darkness to remind him of the man he had been and the man he could yet be. But the past was no refuge. It was a battlefield strewn with shadows and ghosts. The whispers of the dead cried out, demanding reckoning and remembrance, their pain and sorrow, a chorus that echoed through the hollow chambers of his heart. And yet, in their haunting, there was clarity, a burning light that seared fear and doubt, lighting a path through the darkness. The war he waged was not just against gods or enemies, but against the chains of vengeance and guilt that would forever bind him. To be free, he had to face the shadows within, embrace the pain, not as a curse, but as the fire of his highest strength. As night deepened, the stars bloomed above, silent witness, ageless and ancient, their cold light piercing the velvet. Darkness like eyes that had watched empires rise and crumble, the dreams and despairs of gods and men. They stood witness now to a man reborn not in anger, but in endurance and resolve. Kratos was no longer just the ghost of Sparta or just a god of war. He was something more, a presence walking quietly into the unknown, carrying the torch of hope and the unspoken promise to persevere. Even in the midst of destruction, life could endure and be reborn. The distant rumble of thunder sounded faintly on the wind, a reminder of Zeus whose power still crackled in the skies, a tempest that would not be stilled. A god who was judge and executioner, whose caprice decided the destiny of mortals and immortals alike. Their struggle was far from over, for with every flash of lightning, every crash of thunder, was the echo of their strife, a war not only of strength, but of ideals. Zeus fought for order, control, a reign where gods dictated unchallenged and mortals followed divine law. Kratos fought for freedom, choice, a breaking of chains forged by gods who cared little for those they governed. The skies themselves seemed to hold their breath as the tempest gathered on the horizon, dark clouds boiling with contained anger lighting the horizon. With flashes of electric fire, Kratos stood still, a solitary figure carved from shadow and resolved beneath the gathering storm. His heart beat to the rhythm of an ancient drum, a call to war and to destiny, wrapped in a dance as old as time itself. The winds from the mountains carried the scent of rain and ozone, a harbinger of the coming storm and the inevitable conflict that would decide the fate of gods and mortals. In the quiet before the storm, Kratos shared a moment of silent reflection, the hush before fury. The world was bating its breath, the very air thick with the promise of reckoning. Here in this fragile respite lay the core of his journey, not simply a hunger for vengeance, but a search for meaning and redemption beneath the merciless gaze of gods and the spirits of yesterday. He was no longer a sword in the fist of fate, but a man hammering out his own destiny, step by step. The path ahead was uncertain, winding through darkness and light, fraught with peril and fate in equal measure. And still, Kratos walked on with the stubborn confidence of one who had looked death in the eye and come back cleansed in fire and anguish. The shadows of Sparta followed him, a lamenting chorus, a reminder of where he had been, and the price he was willing to pay for the tomorrow he was bold enough to forge. The stars above twinkled like watching eyes, guiding him forward through the night, a silent promise to greet whatever dawn might bring with a heart whole and an unbroken spirit. The story was far from over, for in the war of gods in the still, between storms and the beating heart of a man chained by hope and despair, lay the promise of something new, a beginning forged of ash and fire, wherein the most brutal battles can be waged not with rage, but with courage and determination. The ghost of Sparta was no longer a spirit of destruction, but a flame of perseverance, burning steady and true, lighting the way forward through shadow and silence. The Thunder King and the War Spirit Knight deepened and intensified, like a shroud drawn tight over the earth above the seething earth, where murmurs of a divine conflict seethed in the blackness. The wind whispered promises of ambition and betrayal, weaving through broken branches and rifted stone, carrying the distant rumble of thunder like the slow beat of the heavens. Themselves, Kratos stood still beneath, the seething tempest his gaze fixed upwards, with the storm intensified in fury, like the breath of a sleeping god stirring to wrath. Zeus the Thunder King loomed in the tempest, a figure of storm and fire, his presence as vast and immovable as the heavens he commanded. His eyes burned with the cold fury of lightning. His voice, the thunder's bellow that shattered the mountains and split the night as stillness. He was a god who commanded the storm, not as an instrument, but as a divine right, the very embodiment of power and dominion, tempered in the will to rule gods and mortals. His crown was a wreath of lightning and cloud, his scepter a rod of thunder and flame. He was judge and executioner, a force that demanded obedience and crushed rebellion beneath the foot of divine decree. But on that scarred earth, beneath that boiling sky, stood Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, a warrior hammered out of suffering and rebellion, a man who had fought gods and monsters, and emerged not broken, but reborn, his muscles bunched like steel, tempered in the furnace of constant warfare, his eyes burning with a fire not of divine rage, but of mortal resolve. His blades were silent on his back, but in his heart they sang a song of revenge and liberty, a paean to the strife that had lent his life purpose. They were more than weapons, they were extensions of his very essence, forged in blood, and tempered in sorrow, bearing the weight of every sacrifice, every betrayal, every moment he had refused to yield to fate and gods themselves. The storm above mirrored the storm, within a vortex of power and rage, gathering strength in the heavens, and in the hearts of two souls bound by destiny and conflict. Zeus sought to bind the world in order and law, to fashion a kingdom. Where chaos was crushed beneath the heel of divine order, Kratos sought to shatter those bonds, to overthrow the thrones built on pain, and silence to carve a path where freedom was one not granted, a world where mortals could stand outside the shadow of gods. Lightning forked through the skies, illuminating the serrated peaks of distant mountains, sending strange shadows leaping like phantoms across the earth. The thunder rolled like a drumbeat, echoing the beat of war and fate. Their battle was not merely a clash of arms, but a symphony of wills, a struggle written in the stars and carved into the bones of the earth. Each bolt of lightning was a call to battle, each thunderclap a cry of defiance and command. Kratos lifted his gaze to meet the storm, his breathing serene as the winds that rent around him. He did not flinch or falter, for he had within him a truth more potent than rage or fear. the strength of choice, the will to rise up from the ashes and reclaim the shards of a broken destiny. His journey had been long and fraught with pain, but it had also been a testament to the potency of the human will, a shining beacon in the darkness of gods and monsters. The memory of Lysandra and his daughter Esoth shone like a star in the night skies, a beacon that had guided him through the storm of his past and the night of what was yet to be. They were the fragile hope that had survived alongside him, the anchor that had held him fast. When the storms of rage and despair had threatened to sweep all away, they were the reason for the struggle, not for triumph, but for a world in which that light could still shine. The ground beneath his feet trembled with the whispers of ancient wars, the ground soaked in the blood of those who had come before, warriors and kings, gods and mortals, locked in the ageless ballet of power and fate. The rubble of Sparta lay out like a silent testament to the cost of war and the price of rebellion, a reminder that gods could fall and empires could die, but the spirit of resistance could never be defeated. As the storm grew stronger, Zeus did not address him in words, but in the air itself that snapped and surged around him. His voice was the thunder that boomed across the heavens, the lightning that ripped the night sky asunder, a command that vibrated in the bones of the world. You dare the will of Olympus, ghost of Sparta. You seek to unravel the order that was hammered out by the gods and plunge the world into chaos. But hear this, your defiance shall be shattered like the brittle bones of mortals beneath the heel of divine vengeance. Kratos responded not in speech, but in the steady beat of his heart, the unyielding fire in his eyes. The world you seek to forge is one born of chains and terror. He appeared to say, a world in which gods hold dominion and mortals suffer in silence. But I am the vengeance. I am the storm that topples thrones and quiets the silence. I will not bend to your will, nor acquiesce to your rule, for freedom is the due of all, even those who walk beneath the shadow of gods. The skies exploded in a riot of lightning that lit the world in stark white glory, casting long shadows that twisted and turned like specters unleashed from the bonds of time. The earth trembled and the winds screamed as the storm and the warriors stood poised on the edge of fate, prepared to unleash the fury that would decide the destiny of gods and men. Their battle was not a struggle, but a verdict, a clash between the old and the new, a clash that would echo through the ages and shape the world to come. The world waited with bated breath in that frozen moment between night and day, between annihilation and renewal. The stars shone through the storm clouds like ancient guardians, their silent gaze bearing witness to the drama of power, defiance, and aspiration unfolding below. The air hummed with possibility, a strained quiet before the deafening cry that would herald the new era in the ancient cosmic dance between gods and mortals, between fate and free will. Kratos stood tall beneath the storm, a figure of shadow and light, a man forged in the fire of tragedy and tempered by the will to be reborn. His path was uncertain, marked by danger and sacrifice, but it was a path chosen with eyes open, a path not merely of vengeance, but of redemption and hope. The ghost of Sparta was no longer a specter of death, but a shining beacon of hope, a living testament to the strength of the human spirit to persevere, to struggle, and to rise from the ashes of despair. So let the thunder roll and the lightning illuminate the skies as your breathing slows and your mind drifts easily on the wind of this tale. Let the storm carry you deeper into a world where gods and men are at war, where the fiercest battles are waged not only with sword and lightning, but with the heart to walk the path of hope in the shadows. The myth of Kratos and Zeus continues unfolding, a legend, alive with fire and shadow, and the never-ending search for freedom and peace. The immortal war, Zeus versus the god of war. The conflict of Zeus and Kratos raged like a storm released, the skies themselves trembling as bolts of lightning tore, darksome clouds, and the earth yawned open before their fury. This was not a mere battle of gods and men, but a collision of ideals, wills, and destinies. Woven over centuries of despair and deception, Zeus, the thundering king of Olympus, desired to impose order to maintain a rule permeated by divine decree and unbroken dominance. His eyes gleamed with the self-confidence of a king who held that only his law could contain the world as chaos. But Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, embodied raw, uncut power of mortal defiance. Forged in fire and sorrow he carried, not just swords, but the weight of shattered chains and ruined gods. Each step was an affirmation that even those who had once been subject to the whims of gods could rise and redefine destiny itself. With each swing of his swords, he hacked a path through the maelstrom of Zeus' lightning, his rage a torrent that commanded not just victory, but liberty for all subject to tyranny. Zeus unleashed the full power of the heavens, summoning storms that seethed with the rage of millennia. Thunder boomed like war drums, lightning split the skies with blinding radiance, and the wind screamed like a banshee crying out over the destruction that would soon be unleashed. But Kratos stood against this pounding, not with terror, but with an unshakable resolve, pressing ahead into the storm as if his very being were a tempest brought to life. The clash of divine rage and mortal rage sent shockwaves coursing through the fabric of the world. Mountains shuddered, rivers churned, and the air itself snapped with the raw energy of their conflict. In the cold pause between attacks, words carved as deep as steel were uttered. Zeus spoke of order and destiny, proclaiming the gods. Dominion was the shield that protected existence from devolving into chaos. His voice thundered on the battlefield, echoing the millennial-old dogma that man would be forced to obey under divine providence. But Kratos' voice flat and even contradicted that divine edict. He spoke not of himself alone, but of the countless lives crushed beneath Olympus' iron blanket. You wield power as a jail, he declared, but I fight for the right to smash those walls, even if it costs me the heavens themselves. The two gods engaged in constant strife reflected not just opposition, but warped union each, created by the weight of legacy, each burdened by the cost of power exercised ruthlessly. Zeus regarded Kratos as an image of his own past, a warrior once bound to his will, now replicated the destruction he sought to contain. Kratos saw Zeus as the embodiment of a broken order, a god whose need to rule had rendered him insensitive to the suffering beneath his thunder. And as their battle approached its peak, the skies yawned open with one final burst of lightning, and the earth groaned beneath the force of their fury. This universe suspended its breath, while the god of war and the god of thunder faced each other in the devastated landscape, bruised bodies, souls unbroken. Neither had prevailed by the conventional definition, but both had been irrevocably changed. The impact was not an ending, but a crucible refining new understanding out of devastation. In the aftermath, a tenuous stillness descended on the field. Kratos returned his swords not as a defeat, but as a commitment, a promise to continue onward not as a slave to rage, but as a seeker of freedom and of truth. Zeus watched him depart, a glimmer of something unspoken within his eyes. Perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps remorse, for even a god must answer for the cost of power wielded without mercy. This struggle etched in the fabric of time was a reminder of the endless battle between freedom and control, order and chaos, punishment and redemption. It was a reminder that even gods can be brought to justice for the decisions they make, and that even the most powerful can be pushed to their limits by the determination of one mortal who will not yield. As the dust finally lay and the storm had passed by, the world itself seemed to pulse with possibility renewed. The myth of Zeus and god of war was not yet over, however. In their conflict was the seed of change, the hopeful possibility that out of the ashes of past empires there might grow a future created not in fear, but out of the desire to transcend and redefine destiny. The burden of Olympus and the chains of destiny. In order to understand the full significance of this war, one has to delve further into the background of Olympus and the divine order Zeus fought to uphold. Born from the dark chaos, Zeus came to age amidst brutal dark overthrow of his own father, Cronus, and destined to rule supreme over gods and men alike. His authority was not merely a birthright, but forged in endless trials of divine power and brutal conquest. A king who demanded absolute obedience. Zeus believed that without severe order, the cosmos would descend into endless chaos and ruin. From his seat atop Mount Olympus, Zeus looked out upon the world of mortals, as a shepherd looks upon his sheep, tempering justice and wrath, bestowing favor and punishment in like measure. His thunderbolts were the personification of divine prerogative, the sword that cut down rebellion and the shield that protected order. But beneath this facade of unbendable will seethed another more ominous fear, the terror that his power was not infinite or absolute, and that even the gods themselves were bound by the unbreakable chains of fate. Kratos was the very essence of that fear, the mortal who freed himself from the constraints imposed on him by the gods who shook off the shackles of destiny, with the fury of a man with no more to lose. When Zeus looked upon Kratos, he saw not a mere challenger, but a harbinger of his own destruction. The god of war represented the revolt of mortal will against divine tyranny and the collapse of the old order that Zeus so desperately sought to preserve. This was a battle of philosophy of cosmic magnitude. This was greater than a battle of strength and weapons. It was a war of cosmos philosophy. The divine creation of the gods needed compliance with law and hierarchy, while Kratos symbolized the primal rebellion of freedom, born of pain and self-determination. Their battle was an allegory for the constant struggle between control and chaos, between fate given and fate taken, the storm of wrath and resolve. The fight between Zeus and Kratos was a tempest unleashed upon the world itself. Lightning ripped the heavens asunder with the fury of 1,000 storms. The ground staggered beneath their pummeled fists pounding and the ringing of steel. Mountains trembled and rivers churned as the two armies clashed with a ferocity incomprehensible to mortal minds. Zeus wielded the elements like a god, with the force of a storm, summoning storms like blades, cutting through the very fabric of existence. But Kratos was unyielding his fury, a maelstrom of mortal rage that could not be held back by any god. Each strike was fueled by years of pain, betrayal, and an endless desire to break free of the shackles of fate. His blades screeched through the air, a ballet of death and defiance. He was the storm in flesh, the rage of nature unleashed on the god that sought to bind him in chains of divinity. In the midst of the storm of battle, occasional silences exploded like thunder as the two lashed words, slashing and lethal as knives Zeus thundered in weight of divine authority, affirming that order was the unifying block of the world, and that mortals must bow to the gods in order to survive. His thunder boomed over the battlefields, a soundless reminder of the gods' power over life and death. Kratos replied with a steely and unyielding voice, reminding Zeus that true power was not in victory, but in the ability to choose the course one follows. He spoke of the lives crushed beneath Olympus, as iron fist of the pain that gods who ruled through cruelty and fear inflicted. His words were a beacon of hope, a call to break the chains, even if it meant defying the heavens themselves, the consequences and the seeds of change. When finally the storm had blown and the dust settled, the world was shattered but alive. The battlefield a wound torn across the land, a witness to a conflict that had been greater than simple power or triumph. Neither Zeus nor Kratos had gained total victory, but both were changed forever by the encounter. Their conflict had destroyed antiquated delusions and laid bare the fragile nature of divine power and mortal rebellion. Kratos sheathed his blades not as a defeat, but as a sign of his continued journey, a journey from wrath to wisdom, from vengeance to the pursuit of freedom. Zeus sat in silence, a bewildered mix of recognition and regret in his eyes. For even the most powerful god has to endure the consequences of wielding power without sympathy or wisdom. This was a battle greater than war. It was the turning point of the timeless tragedy of gods and men, a reminder that power must be balanced with mercy, that freedom entails courage, and that even gods are bound by the choices that they make. The myth of Zeus and Kratos was far from over, but in their battle was the promise of renewal and hope. At dawn break over shattered ground, a gentle light kissed the horizon, and with it was offered the promise of renewal. The world held its collective breath on the precipice of transformation. The story of the god of war and the king of Olympus was one still being written, a story of devastation and rebirth, of disorder and balance, and of the unfaltering will to forge one his own destiny apart from the gods, the shattered thrones, and the dawn of reckoning. The dust descended slowly like a thick curtain drawn over the shattered battle, ground upon which gods had clashed and mortal destinies had been forever altered. The air was thick and stagnant with the reverberation of thunder and the fading rumble of war. It was a stillness that pressed upon the shattered rocks and twisted metal as a warning to all those that remained behind that things would never remain the same again. Zeus, standing alone atop the shattered remnants of his once great throne, his shape etched out in shadow against the glow of the dying day. His eyes storm clouds and remorse, his breathing steady, but laden with the weight of a rain. Now broken, the thunder which had long been subject to his will was silenced, and in its place was a hollow that howled the truth he had long failed to see. A truth which even the gods could fail, even the kings could suffer, and that power derived from fear was as thin as the parched bones. Beneath his feet, Kratos walked through the desolate ruins of Olympus, his steps slow, measured, but resolute. He carried no boast or triumph, but only the shadowed knowledge that the war he had fought was not for domination or revenge, but for the hope of something new. The swords on his shoulders, though sheathed, sang softly with the memory of battles won and fought, their edges still keen with the fire of his rage and wounds of his way. But in this instant, they were no longer just instruments of destruction, but symbols of a will forged in the heat of suffering and tempered in the light of hope. The struggle between God and man had torn asunder the very fabric of fate, playing out the fragile mortal threads that lay beneath. Divine omnipotence. The rocks of Olympus trembled under the weight of the arrogance of its own might and the sound of the challenge that Kratos had let loose. The king of gods had met not just a warrior, but a reckoning, a mirror held to his own arrogance and the cost of a reign ruled by domination and terror. Zeus had tried to tame chaos with lightning and law, and found instead a tempest in the fury of one man who refused to submit in the calm that followed the start of storms. Gods spoke to one another in low tone and with overtones of fear, their ancient belief dethroned by reportedly mortal defiance. The time of unquestioned godly domination broken, and with reportedly it, the precarious peace that had rested so long upon the Olympian thrones. Shocks of change coursed through heaven and earth alike, affecting all quarters of existence, where there were hopes of mortals and schemes of gods. Kratos stood on the cusp of a new sunrise, one forged from the ashes of war and the dissolution of the old. Pantheon, no longer the unseen instrument of rage, but a human conscious of the burden of choice. The path before him was uncharted, a labyrinth of shadow and light, where each step promised redemption or devastation. The swords that had scarred holy flesh now pointed the way toward a living but uncertain future. The ruins of Olympus rested like a tomb beneath the rising dawn, a monument that even the greatest can topple, and that, no, throne endures. The marble columns split and crumbled testified to lost grandeur, and of pride brought low. The earth itself seemed to beat with a gentle pulse of renewal, a faint pulse that testified to rebirth and the cycles of life and death and transformation. Kratos looked out towards the rising dawn, its light spreading gold and fire upon the scorched ground, a sign not just of endings, but of beginnings. The night had been one of long durations and of the fury of the gods. But now the day was summoning with the gentle promise of peace and the chance to forge a destiny greater than the darkness of vengeance. The ghost of Sparta no longer stood bound in chains, hammered together in anger, but stepped forward as a bringer of hope, a living testament to the power of freedom from such chains. The memory of Lysandra remained with him, a soft fire that melted the icy parts of his heart, her smile a light of serenity in the face of storm. her spirit a calm that informed him of what was worth fighting for, over blood and war. In her memory, Kratos found the strength to face the unknown, the resolve to walk an alternative path where power was not measured by ruin, but by the will to transform. The gods of Olympus vanished in the mist of myth, their voices, faint echoes borne on the gusts that stirred the woods and fields of the world below, waiting and watching uncertain if dawn would bring renewal or ruin, their reign challenged by a mortal who had countered destiny to become greater than the cycle of life and death forged in the world they abandoned. And so the story goes on the battle between Zeus and the god of war, a chapter in an endless saga wherein the borders of godhood and man are blurred. World itself holds its breath poised between the last dying embers of a dying empire and the transient glory of a new dawn. A dawn where the choice to decide lies not in the hands of gods, but in the hearts of men courageous enough to grasp it. As you rest here now in the quiet following the storm, let the quiet settle around you like a restorative tide. Let the tale of shattered thrones and hope, renewed, carry you further into a place where even deities must pay the price for their strength, and where the fiercest battles are those fought within. Let your breath slow, and your heart be open to the possibility that out of the ruins of war can come the ability to rebuild and the courage to rise again. For the ghost of Sparta walks beyond the battlefield, now no longer as a harvester of anger, but as a light of change, a living flame burning constantly and brightly in the infinite darkness, reminding us all that regardless of how glorious the fall, how deep the cuts, there is always something to move on, always a dawn to look forward to beyond the darkness, always something yet to be written. The veil between Olympus and mortals, the air was thick and heavy with the dust of broken heavens descending upon a world forever altered. The stars themselves seemed dull beneath a cracked sky bereft of the bloodshed of gods. The war between Zeus and Kratos had rent asunder not only flesh and bone, but the very fabric of divine order, unraveling the threads that had once bound mortals and immortals together in a fragile and pitiless balance. The throne of Olympus now shook cracked, a symbol of power, losing its radiance beneath the storm, gathering around rebellion and retribution. Under the broken sky, Kratos marched not as a victor, but a bearer of weights heavier than any mortal man had ever known. Each step a muted echo of the untold numbers of lives, lost and shattered beneath the weight of divine cruelty and mortal defiance. His blades rested still upon his back, their edges dulled not by lack of use, but by the shifting purpose that had come to guide him. No longer mere tools of destruction, they had become symbols of a deeper battle, the battle for freedom from the yoke of destiny decreed by gods who ruled with unyielding hands. Zeus lingered among the ruin of his broken kingdom, his form wavering like a receding storm cloud poised between rage and introspection. His voice no longer thundered with unyielding power, but whispered as a question carried on the wind, a question born of centuries of unchallenged supremacy and contempt for rebellion in his very bones. For all his might and power, Zeus was faced with the sobering truth that power without pity was an empty throne built of sand and tears. The relentless sternness he tried to exert now teetered on the edge of collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. About them the gods stood quietly in the shadows, their immortal eyes a palette of fear, pride, and doubt, the day of uncontested. Olympus ended its run dawning on a time when mortals were daring enough to defy the gods, where power waxed and waned in ways both dreadful and frightful. The gods who had once moved with the knowledge of certainty were now prisoners of a new world, a world wrought by the brutal wrath and resolve of men like Kratos. The battle between Kratos and Zeus had been more than a battle of fists and fury. It was a battle of ideals, a battle between the unyielding order of gods and the unfettered, untamed spirit of mortal rebellion. Zeus represented a vision of control, stability, and order, a universe in which gods dictated the fate of all who fell beneath them. But Kratos represented chaos, not as destruction, but as liberty of force breaking divine shackles to create a pathway in which destiny was no longer predetermined but brought about through will and choice. In the silence that came after Kratos was at a crossroads, his heart heavy with the cost of his journey, but burning with the burning hope of rebirth. The ghosts of Olympus still hovered in the wind, carrying whispers of betrayal, sacrifice, and lost old power. But now those whispers carried another harmony, a harmony of resistance, rebirth, and the cautious hope that even the worst wounds healed with the passage of time. The universe beyond Olympus was vast and indistinct, an unrolled canvas with brushstrokes of war wounds and illumination of potential. Forests whispered ancient mysteries, older than the earth herself. Mountains taciturn sentinels who had seen the rise and fall of gods and men. The mortal world no longer a dark place at the feet of the gods, but one where the tapestry of destiny was rewoven in the hands of those who dared to seize it. Kratos was at the edge of a cliff overlooking an ocean that shone in the dying light. Its waves spoke of journeys yet to be made, of wars fought not just with sword, but with mind and heart. The horizon churned with the colors of dusk, a reminder that even out of the darkest night would always come the dawn. That the journey before him, though dangerous, was also filled with hope for healing and change. At that time, Kratos was not the ghost of a past defined by rage, but the harbinger of a future defined by choice. Chains of his former servitude to gods and fate were shattered at his feet to be replaced by the resolve to walk a new road, a road not defined by destruction, but by the humble power to build and protect, to honor those fallen to the savagery of divine war, and to forge a world where power was not a weapon, but a responsibility. Lyssandra's memory burned deep within him, an eternal flame that illuminated the shadows, reminding him of the love that had once rooted him and the peace he longed beyond the never-ending cycle of vengeance. Her spirit was his compass that guided him through the storm, the soft voice drawing him toward a fate not written in blood, but in hope. As night closed in about him, Kratos felt the rhythm of the world at his feet. The beat of gods and men mingled in an ancient dance of light and darkness. The silences of Olympus retreated into legend, borne on the winds to the remotest fringes of the earth, where heroes would live and perish, and songs would be sung in hush and rhyme. The tale of Zeus and the god of war was far from over. It was one carved out of the ravages of war and the courage of those who had dared to fight against the heavens. But it was now also a story of rebirth, a testament to the enduring power of choice and the irrepressible hope that even out of the ashes of burned out thrones a new dawn could be created. And so the ghost of Sparta walked further, no longer as the harbinger of doom, but as the beacon of change. His every step a quiet vow to build a future where freedom was no dream, but a living reality. Future where gods and men alike must realize that the strongest is not the master, but the one who dares to embrace change, to forgive, and to rise. Again, rest now in the quiet of this tale. Let the story carry you deeper into the realm of gods and men, where wars are fought on mortal and immortal battlefields, and where every choice resounds throughout eternity. Let your breathing deepen and your mind stretch to the possibility that even in the blackest night, a spark may be lit that will burn forever bright. For the path of Kratos and Zeus is not merely combat. It is a forever test of power, sacrifice, and redemption, a reminder that even the strongest are held accountable for what they do, and that true strength comes from the capacity to change and learn as the stars look silently down upon their eternal thrones. May you always possess beside you the whispered courage of the ghost of Sparta, a courage tempered not in rage, but in strength, a fire burning hot and unceasing in the endless night, reminding all of us that whatever wild the storm, the dawn shall ever break. The dawn beyond Olympus, the end of an era and the beginning of a new way. The pale morning crept stealthily over the horizon to touch the shattered fragments of Olympus with a hesitant light, as if the world itself were hesitant to welcome a new dawn after the weary night of divine turmoil. The gods stood idly in the darkness of their shattered thrones, their immortal bodies tired and frayed, their dominion once absolute and unchallenged, now precarious and uncertain, as if the earth beneath their feet might turn against them at the slightest vibration. The dominion of Zeus. The Thunderer was no longer an unbreakable reality, but a memory haunted by uncertainty and shadow. Kratos stood on the brink of this broken world, his figure, cut into the ascending dawn, a shadow of strength and fatigue. The scars on his body testified to wars waged not only against gods, but against the darkness in his own heart. Each gasp for air was weighed down by the weight of the past, but it contained the spark of something else. A fiery hope smelted not through conquest, but through understanding. Out of the ashes of rage and fire, an odyssey had begun, not plotted through fury, but through the soft strength of redemption and choice. The battle with Zeus had remade the world, not only the fate of Olympus, but the very countenance of power itself. For centuries, the gods had ruled from their pedestals, guiding the lives of men and shaping fates with unfaltering grasp. But the brutal rebellion of Kratos shattered the myth that divine caprice was invincible, that the throne of Olympus was unattainable. The gods had been forced to reckon with their own fallibility, the price of their cruelty, and the limits of their power. All around Kratos, the world revived, fields long buried began to live. Rivers carved new paths through ancient lands and forests, shared secrets of rebirth and growth. The world of men awoke from slumber, no longer a shadow in the gods' shade, but a power that had to be heard and seen. The memories of the past mixed with the potential of the future in a hymn of transformation, pulling through every leaf and stone. The sky, once lashed by storms, now breathed steadily and slowly. The air was no longer electric with thunder, but with the quiet before something new, something unexpected, but not without the dawn of darkness. The wounds of war ran deep, not only to the earth, but to the hearts of gods and men alike. The thirst for power, the desire for domination, the wounds of loss and betrayal, these shadows still hung about, casting long fingers across the fragile light. The path forward was unknown, fraught with danger and sacrifice, but it was a path Kratos was willing to walk, armed not only with swords, but with knowledge born of pain and the will to confront the unknown. During the quiet moments between the rising day and the dying night, Kratos remembered Lysandra, her face a beacon of peace and love in the storm of his life, her soul remaining like a gentle fire in his breast, reminding him of the cost above war. The vision for a world where the cycle of vengeance could end, where wounds could heal, and where the ghosts of the past could at last be still. At her memory, he did not discover sorrow, but strength, not regret, but the passion to keep going and to protect the fragile beauty still left in the world. The gods themselves were changing, some fleeing into the shadows, nursing their wounds, others beginning to question the old ways and the endless cycle of war and domination. Some had disappeared into silence, their seats cold and empty, others with words of balance and humility in their mouths, anomalous words upon the lips of immortals who had long assumed themselves beyond reproach. A new time was dawning, not dictated by the sheer bluster of a king, but hammered out by the collective will of gods and mortals, learning to coexist and to honor the fine balance between power and freedom. Kratos looked out over the land, the destroyed temples, the quiet forests, the distant mountains, standing like watchful sentinels. He saw not only destruction, but the unworked materials of renewal, the shards of a shattered world waiting to be reworked anew. The path ahead would be long and fraught with peril, but it was a path he desired to take for the possibility of a future, where choice and hope could be more than a distant dream under the shadow of Olympus. He had no expectations that peace would be a simple thing, but in every step there was resolve, in every breath, a choice to continue forward without being held back by the blood that had before darkened his way. The blackness of night slowly gave way to morning stars, fading in the radiance of a new dawn. As Kratos departed from the ruins of the gods, upon him he carried the lessons of battle and loss, the silent strength of endurance, and the unconquerable hope that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the light of life and freedom could never be extinguished. The burden on his back had changed in shape and character. It was no longer tested in fury and vengeance, but in recollection and meaning, a burden, chosen not forced. The saga of Zeus and the god of war was no longer a story of conflict and devastation. It had transformed into a testament to the unyielding power of transformation, the resilience of the human heart, and the everlasting waltz between gods and men, a story that reminds us all that regardless of the extent of the wounds, the ferocity of the storms, there is always a dawning waiting out there on the horizon. A dawning where valor is redefined, where silences are sacred, where love and remembrance walk hand in hand with loss and transformation. And so Kratos walked before the rising sun, no longer as a conqueror, but as a guardian of promise, a light of hope in a world struggling to find its path through the embers of its own destruction. His path was not yet complete, but the path that he now walked was that of atonement and rebirth, a path along which the greatest of struggles, perhaps, were not to be fought with blade, but with the desire to forgive, to rebuild, and to arise again. For in every broken shard, there was the seed of something unbreakable in every toppled column, a story, waiting to be told again. Let your breathing get slow, and your thoughts sink into the still strength of this moment. Let the story carry you beyond the struggle of the gods to the gentle embrace of morning, where endings are beginnings and where hope for peace glows, hot and fierce in the blackness of darkness. The wind breathes with it the gentlest whisper of songs, unspoken prayers, unsaid dreams unseen, now gently rising like mist from the ancient stones. For even the greatest fall, and even the broken may rise. The story of Zeus and the god of war is a story of endings and beginnings of destruction and of hope, a reminder that power is not in control, but in the ability to change, the will to heal, and the courage to continue. It is the story of a man who once warred with fate and learned the greatest victory was in the learning to walk another path. Rest here in this peaceful aware that the tale continues past the pages of myth and legend, past the gods and men as wars. The way of the ghost of Sparta is a way within ourselves, a passage through darkness and light, which reaches the still dawn of knowledge and peace. A way that teaches us that not by the weight we carry, but by the strength with which we carry it are we shaped into what we become. And when the initial light of dawn bathes the world, may you carry with you the gentle fire of hope and endurance, a flame no tempest can extinguish, a light which burns forever within the endless waltz between the past and the future, between war and peace, between desolation and redemption. This is the gentle promise whispered over the ruin, the wind between conflicts, the silent step towards something more than mere survival. It is dawnbreak on Olympus, and it begins now. Echoes of a forgotten pantheon, when gods fade and myths endure. The air hung thick with silence, a silence not born of peace, but of absence, an absence that clung to the stones of Olympus and curled through the halls, where once divine voices thundered. The world felt hollow, as if something immeasurable had departed, leaving behind only the shadows of what had been. The thrones of the gods now stood cold, and empty, towering monuments to power that had crumbled under the weight of its own consequence. Time had moved forward, but Olympus remained still caught in a perpetual dusk, where even the light seemed hesitant to touch marble that had once gleamed beneath the heavens. Kratos stood at the edge of the great amphitheater, his eyes sweeping across the vast emptiness where gods had once gathered to shape the world. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor, now covered in dust and vines that slithered like time itself, claiming the divine Ares, Athena, Apollo. Hermes, once revered and feared, now only names carved into forgotten altars. Their voices, once filled the skies, now faded into silence. Their deeds, once written in the stars, now barely a whisper carried on the wind. It was here among these ruins that memory and myth collided, where stories were no longer sung in reverence, but muttered as warnings. Kratos had lived those stories, bled through them, carved them into the very fabric of the world with blade and wrath. He remembered not as a scholar remembers books, but as a scar remembers the wound. Not all the gods had fallen in battle, but all had fallen from grace, and their fall was not marked by thunder or flame, but by silence, the kind that swallows entire ages. The mortals below Olympus had begun to change. They no longer lit fires in the temples, nor did they gather to pray beneath the gaze of statues. Their offerings had grown cold, their chants faded. Their hearts turned not to the divine, but to each other, finding strength not from the heavens, but from the earth beneath their feet and the hands that held theirs. The world had not ended without the gods. It had merely changed. The sun still rose, the river still flowed, the seasons turned, and the children laughed without fear of divine wrath. Yet the question lingered, what becomes of gods who are no longer worshipped? Where do the echoes of Olympus go when they can no longer command the skies? The answer was not in the heavens, but in the stories. The tales carried by old men around fires, and by mothers to their children at night. The gods had become myths, and in becoming myths, they had become something different, something less powerful perhaps, but strangely more eternal. Their cruelty forgotten, their wisdom exaggerated, their flaws softened by the sands of time. Kratos walked through the crumbling corridors of Olympus, now more mausoleum than palace. His hands trailed the cracked stone, etched with runes that no longer held power, only memory. The faces carved into the columns seemed to watch him with hollow eyes, not with judgment, but with resignation. They too had seen the end, and they knew it was not fire or sword that had brought it, but change inevitable and unrelenting. He paused before the altar of Athena, once the goddess of wisdom and war. Her likeness had crumbled the marble, cracked the face gone. Her temple was overtaken by roots and silence. Here Kratos bowed his head not in reverence, but in recognition. She had fought, not with rage, but with cunning. She had challenged him not with force, but with consequence. She had tried to warn him, and now her temple stood as testament to a warning. Ignored deeper in the ruins, more memories stirred. He passed the remains of Hermes' wing sculpture, toppled, and broken wings scattered like fallen leaves. The messenger who once danced between the worlds, now silenced by time. A mural half faded told of Apollo, whose songs once healed, now faded into stone. No longer sung, but absorbed into the still air. Kratos paused beside it, running his calloused fingers along the painted lyre, feeling the faintest hum, as though the music had not died, but gone to sleep. Beyond the crumbling gates of Olympus, the world moved forward. Cities rose in the lowlands, built not in devotion, but in resilience. They honored their dead with gardens, not sacrifices. They built monuments not to gods, but to ancestors, to ideas, to hope. The gods had given fire, but mortals had learned to tend it. The gods had drawn the stars, but mortals had learned to map them. In their absence, humankind had not fallen, but risen stumbling sometimes. Yes, but rising all the same. Kratos stepped out onto the cliff that overlooked the valley below, where morning mist curled around forests and rivers, and the sound of a distant forge echoed through the trees. He saw not a world in ruin, but a world rebuilding, a world uncertain, but unshackled. His presence was not needed here, not as a god, not as a ghost. The battles he had fought were part of another age, their echoes fading into the soil and stone. And yet, even here, the past remained not as chains, but as lessons, not as curses, but as memory. The gods would not return, not as they had been, but their stories would continue, whispered in twilight, sung by bards, painted on cave walls, retold not in fear, but in wonder. And perhaps that was the fate the gods had never foreseen, to lose their temples, but gain eternity in tale and song. Kratos turned away from Olympus, leaving behind not just a mountain, but an era. His path lay not in rebuilding the divine, but in honoring what came after. A world where might did not make right, where rage was not purpose, and where the greatest power was in restraint and remembrance. The wind whispered behind him, carrying with it the last breath of a dying age and the first breath of a world finally free. Yet even as he walked away, the mountain did not disappear. It remained a reminder, a relic and a witness. Its silent peaks, etched into the horizon, like scars on the sky. It would not be rebuilt, and yet it would never be forgotten. Olympus had become a place not of rule, but of reflection, where the divine had faltered and the mortal had risen. Perhaps that is what true legacy means. Not power etched in stone or command, sealed by lightning, but a story that survives long after the storm may. Memory that walks in the quiet steps of those who remember, not because they fear, but because they understand. And so the ghost of Sparta walked into the morning mist, carrying not the fury of a warrior, but the patience of a witness and the calm of one who has seen the rise and fall of gods and chosen to walk a different path. The twilight of immortality. The wind whispered low through the crumbling corridors of Olympus, carrying with it not the chants of worship, nor the thunderous footfalls of gods, but dust and memory. Where once the heavens had rung with declarations of divine right and the clangor of celestial war, now there was only the hush of a world. Slowly forgetting Kratos, walked these paths not as a warrior seeking conquest, but as a shade returning to the grave of a time long dead. Each echo of his footstep was met not with challenge, but with emptiness, the kind that settles in places where even echoes have grown tired. He passed under archways split by vines, past statues whose faces had worn smooth with time, their once proud visages eroded by wind and rain into featureless masks. The mighty colonnades of the gods stood chipped and leaning, like aging giants slouched in their fading thrones. The halls that had once shimmered with divine energy were draped now in moss and twilight. Above him, the sky was gray and formless, as though Olympus itself had become unmoored from the world and drifted into a realm beyond light. And shadow, a place that time no longer cared to visit Kratos, did not speak. He had learned that words like gods could wither and vanish. Silence was more fitting, now a silence that had been earned through lifetimes of fury and ruin. This silence of a man who had screamed into the void and heard nothing back, and now had only himself and the weight of what had been lost. He paused before the shattered dome of the assembly hall, where the gods had once debated the fate of mankind. There, beneath the broken fragments of its ceiling, weeds grew tall, and birds nested where once immortals had ruled. The power that had once radiated from this place, vast and absolute, was now nothing more than warmth, caught in stone long after the fire had died. He entered slowly inside the remains of a grate. Frescoes still clung to the high wall, faded images of deities in radiant battle, hurling stars and lightning, casting judgments from clouds. But the colors had bled into one another, faces were smeared into abstraction. Even their divine glory, once unbearable to behold, was now a blur of crumbling pigment. He reached out, brushing a finger along the edge of Athena's painted shield, the flakes of old paint falling like dried petals. Athena. The name struck something deep in him. Not pain, not anger, but something quieter, a distant echo. She had been his adversary and his teacher. Her wisdom, sharp as any blade, had once cut through the fog of his wrath. And now here in this hollowed ruin, she was neither enemy nor god, only a memory half erased by time and storms. Kratos turned and continued on deeper still. As he passed into what had once been the private sanctum of Zeus, the air grew colder, not with temperature, but with remembrance. The room was vast, circular, its walls once mirrored in gold and silver. Now only dull metal remained tarnished and flaking. In the center of the chamber lay the broken remains of the throne, a seat carved from black obsidian, once set with jewels that shimmered like captured lightning. Now shattered Zeus, the king of gods. The father who had never been one, Kratos approached the throne, each step deliberate. His eyes did not look upon the seat as one might a prize or relic, but as one might a battlefield after the war has passed. He reached the dais and stood still. The wind whispered again. Or was it something more, some final breath trapped within these walls? He lowered himself onto one knee, not in submission, but in meditation. In this room, gods had decreed fates. In this room, destinies had been manipulated like chess pieces, and now only dust played upon the floor. The silence here was so complete, It felt like a presence in itself, a final god who had waited behind all others, patient and inevitable. Outside the sanctum, the world below Olympus stirred villages that had once shivered beneath the gaze of gods now flourished. They told stories still, yes, but not in worship and curiosity. Children asked questions, and mothers answered with stories. Stories of thunder and fire, of wrath and wisdom. But the edge was softened, the terror dulled. What had once been gospel was now metaphor, myth, parable. The gods were becoming something else, entirely not masters, but legends, not forces to obey, but tales to learn from. Kratos walked the length of the sanctum one final time. He traced his hand along the wall, where once the lineage of Zeus had been etched, his sons, his wars, his victories. The etchings were nearly gone now, just ghosts in stone. And then Kratos turned away. He left the sanctum not with reverence, but with finality. He passed through the halls where Hermes had once boasted, where Apollo's lyre had strummed the very heartbeat of the cosmos, where Dionysus had spilled wine and laughter through chambers now barren and echoing. Each step was a step away, not just from Olympus, but from a chapter in the long, painful book of his life. Outside, the mountain wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the valleys below. It mingled with the scent of age and ruin, creating a strange harmony, the scent of endings and beginnings bound together. Kratos stood at the edge of the path leading down from Olympus. He turned back, once looking upon the mountain, not as a throne, but as a tomb for gods, a tomb for vengeance, and then he descended. Below, the world continued, fields swayed with crops, rivers gleamed in morning light, cities bustled, and the lives of men and women moved on, no longer concerned with the whims of gods above. And Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, the slayer of Olympus, walked among them, unseen, not as a hero, not as a god, but as a man who had once burned the heavens, and now sought only peace in the quiet corners of a world, learning to live without fear. But Olympus did not vanish entirely. In dreams and stories, in old songs hummed on long roads, the gods lived on. They would never return as they had been, but their echoes would shape the myths of tomorrow. And perhaps that was enough. Not dominion, but memory. Not fear, but wonder. Kratos understood this. As the road wound onward, and the mountain faded behind him, he carried not the weight of Olympus, but the memory of its fall. A memory not for vengeance, but for warning. A reminder that no power, no matter how divine, is eternal. That even the mightiest must listen. That silence is not absence, but consequence. He walked through new lands, where mortals no longer trembled at the sound of thunder, where people looked to one another, not to the skies, to find meaning and guidance. The temples had crumbled, but communities had risen in their place, places where kindness held more sway than sacrifice, and where the stories of gods were told beside those of ancestors, lovers, and heroes, not with reverence, but with wonder and awe. In the marketplace, the name Kratos was unknown. In the fields, he was a stranger in the hearts of children. He was no ghost of war, but perhaps a traveler with stories too old to tell. Yet as he moved through their lives quietly and without announcement, the winds of Olympus still followed him, carrying with them the hush of forgotten legends. He did not try to reclaim his past, nor hide from it. It was part of him, as scars are part of skin, as silence is part of music. He bore it and walked with it, and in doing so transformed it. From burden into meaning, from wrath into wisdom, the twilight of immortality had passed, and in its place, the first dawn of something altogether new. Ashes of the eternal flame, the road wound long and low through valleys, where the shadows of once sacred mountains fell across the earth, like the arms of giants too. Weary to rise again, Kratos walked that road alone, each step steady, each breath, drawn not in fear or fury, but in the quiet recognition of something vast and sorrowful having come to its end. Around him the world pulsed, not with divine magic or heavenly fire, but with the slow rhythm of life, renewed crops swaying in the wind, birds darting through trees, children laughing without care, or ritual Olympus was far behind him. Now, but not gone, not truly, for the mountain remained in the shape of memory, in the outline of every temple, now covered in ivy, and in the hearts of those who still whispered stories around firelight. Yet what once had been thunderous had become gentle. What once had been feared had become wondered at, and what once had ruled now rested in silence and stone. Kratos moved through a village tucked into the curve of a green valley, and though no one knew his name, they looked upon him with neither awe nor dread, but with a gaze reserved for those who seemed to carry the weight of many years. The smith nodded to him as he passed the baker offered warm bread. A child, curious and bold, stepped forward and asked if he had once climbed the sky itself. Kratos said nothing, but the girl smiled anyway and ran off with the kind of laughter that could banish ghosts. In that laughter, he heard something older than the gods, something deeper than the songs of Olympus. He heard the sound of a world free of divine judgment, where a child could grow not under the shadow of prophecy or wrath, but under the light of their own choosing. This was what the gods had never understood or had feared to see, that their dominion was not necessary, only assumed that their temples were not eternal, only grand that their flames, though bright, could be extinguished by the breath of time itself. And in that extinguishing came not ruin but release. He walked further until he came to a hill overlooking a wide plain where ruins jutted from the earth like bones of a forgotten beast. The remains of a temple to Poseidon, half sunk in the soil, its columns broken and covered in moss. The sea god once bellowed commands to the waves. Now his name was carved into a stone tablet leaned against a tree where flowers had been left not by priests but by children pretending to be gods themselves. Kratos sat beside that ruin and for a long time did not move. He let the wind wash over him, cool and scented with earth and spring. His eyes closed not in weariness but in contemplation. For so long he had fought, rage destroyed, he had torn down Olympus, not out of vision but out of vengeance. But vengeance is a fire that consumes not only the world but the self. And now, with nothing left to burn, he found in the ashes a strange and unexpected clarity. It was not enough to end the reign of gods. One must also learn to live in the silence that follows, to breathe in a world that no longer bends beneath divine decree, to find meaning not in conquest, but in stillness. And so Kratos rose and moved on. He came upon a grove hidden deep in the forest, where once there had stood a shrine to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. The stones were fallen, the altar gone, yet in the trees the light filtered through like strands of gold. And deer moved unafraid between shafts of sun and shadow. Nature had reclaimed her temple, not with vengeance, but with patience. The wild had no need for gods, for it had always known how to endure, how to wait, how to grow again from ruin. He knelt there not in prayer, but in presence, and touched the ground, feeling the heartbeat of the world. Beneath his calloused hands, this was not Olympus. This was not power or prophecy. This was simply being, and in that simple act, he understood more than he had on any battlefield. Night fell, and the stars came out no longer arranged by gods into signs and omens, but scattered across the sky like the memories of a forgotten age. He lay beneath them and stared upward, and for the first time in many years, he felt something close to peace. Not joy, not sorrow, not redemption. Just peace, the kind that comes when all debts have been paid, when all wars have ended. In his dreams that night he did not see Zeus or Ares or Athena. He saw Lysandra and Calliope, their faces soft and shining, not with the pain of loss, but with the light of love remembered. He did not reach for them. He only watched and let them be, and in doing so let himself be too. When dawn came, he rose and continued down the road, not toward any great destiny or final battle, but simply forward. The world opened before him not with grandeur, but with promise. There would be no more altars, no more thrones, no more declarations carved into stone. There would be fields to walk, stories to hear, lives to witness. The gods would never return, not as they had been, and perhaps that was mercy, for in their fall they had left behind something more valuable than power or fear. They had left behind space, space for mortals to rise, space for truth, to be shaped by hands not stained in blood, space for the divine, to be found not in temples, but in moments. A mother lifting her child to the sky, a lover singing to the moon, a farmer planting seeds in the soil with hope, not demand. Kratos would walk among them not as a god, not as a ghost, but as a man with history carved into his skin and silence carved into his soul. And when he would pass into legend, as all things do, his name would not be spoken with dread, but perhaps with wonder, with curiosity, with the kind of reverence that does not bow, but listens. The pantheon had fallen, but its echoes would remain not to command, but to remind that even gods can fall, that even mortals can rise, that power is fleeting, but memory is forever. And so the journey continued not toward Olympus, but away from it, not upward, but outward, not into war, but into the quiet fields of a world free and waking and endlessly waiting to be lived. Let this tale settle in you like morning fog on the hills, soft and slow. Let your breath follow the rhythm of these old roads. Let your mind drift gently through the ruins of myth and into the roots of your own story. The gods are gone, but you remain, and in your steps their echoes whisper on. The hollow crown and the silent flame continued the dawn, spread slowly its light, spilling like liquid gold over hills and valleys, touching every leaf and stone with the gentle promise of a new beginning. Kratos walked on, feeling the pulse of the waking world beneath his feet. The birds began their songs, and the rivers sang softly, as if the earth itself breathed anew. The quiet majesty of life, unfolding in spite of everything, was a balm to a soul long battered by war and loss. He thought of the gods who once claimed Olympus as their eternal throne, those beings who wielded power with hands both cruel and magnificent. Yet power without compassion is like a flame that consumes only itself, leaving behind nothing but cold ashes. Kratos had learned this truth in blood and sorrow, and now carried it like a torch to light the way forward. The silent flame within him was a paradox, a fire, born from destruction, yet filled with the yearning to build, to heal, to protect. It was a fire not of domination, but of freedom, a flame that burned for all who had suffered under the weight of divine caprice. For those who had lived in shadows cast by gods, now fading into legend around him, the world was changing. The once silent valleys now hummed with life. The broken temples gave way to forests dense and wild, where animals roamed free, and the winds whispered secrets of resilience. The mortals who had risen from fear now walked boldly, shaping their destinies with hands calloused but hearts hopeful. They learned to dance with the changing tides of fate rather than be crushed beneath them. Kratos felt the stirring of something long forgotten within himself. The faintest ember of peace, a quiet hope that perhaps the cycle of wrath and ruin could be broken, that a new story could be written not in the blood of gods, but in the courage of mortals. A story where strength was measured not by conquest, but by the grace to forgive and the will to endure the hollow. Crown was a reminder that power without wisdom and mercy was destined to fall, that even the mightiest could be undone by their own hubris. Yet within the hollow, there was also space for renewal. The emptiness was not just loss, but possibility. The silence, not just absence, but a canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of a different future. As Kratos descended from the heights of Olympus, the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain and the distant song of a child. Laughing, the road ahead was long and uncertain, but it was alive with the promise of change. Each step he took echoed with the footsteps of those who dared to dream of a world beyond gods, beyond vengeance, beyond fear. He understood now that his journey was no longer about destruction or defiance, but about becoming a guardian of that fragile hope, a keeper of the silent flame that could illuminate even the darkest night, a bearer of stories that would inspire not terror, but wonder. The stars above began to fade as the morning sun claimed the sky, bathing the world in warm light. The shadows of Olympus grew smaller and more distant until they were just a memory carried on the breeze. A memory that would remind those who came after of the cost of power, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Kratos walked on with the hollow crown behind him and the silent flame within his heart, knowing that the true battle was not for thrones or gods, but for the soul of the world itself. And as the light grew brighter and the day unfolded, he found peace in the simple truth that even in a world without gods, there was still room for heroes, for hope, and for the quiet flames that refused to be extinguished. And so this chapter closes on a note of gentle resolve. A story not of endings, but of beginnings. A tale carried forward on the winds of dawn, whispering to all who listen that from the ruins of the past, the future is born anew, and in the hearts of those who dare to rise, the silent flame burns ever brighter. Beyond the fading shadows of Olympus, Kratos felt the vastness of the world stretch. Endlessly before him, mountains rolled like ancient giants across the horizon, rivers wound like silver threads weaving through forests, dense with whispers of life, unseen yet deeply felt. The earth beneath his feet was alive, pulsing with the resilience of countless generations who had endured and thrived despite gods who fell and empires that crumbled. The people who now walked the lands were no longer shackled by fear of divine wrath. They lived with the knowledge that power could be both blessing and curse, that the gods who once ruled were but part of a greater tapestry, woven with mortal hands. Their stories interlaced not with chains, but with threads of freedom and choice. They raised homes from stone and wood gardens, from barren fields, and hopes from the ashes of old worlds. Kratos watched children play beneath the wide sky, their laughter ringing clear and unburdened. They ran freely, chasing dreams untainted by shadows of gods past or the weight of legacy. Their eyes shone with wonder, the purest form of faith, not in divinity, but in life itself, the promise that every dawn brought a chance to shape the world anew. He saw farmers tending fields where once sacrifices were, made their hands weathered but gentle, coaxing growth from earth that had known too much blood. Their songs were not hymns to gods, but celebrations of earth, rain, sun, and the enduring spirit of those who toil. Their resilience was a quiet rebellion, a testament to the strength found in simple acts of creation, in the village's storytellers, gathered weaving tales that honored not gods, but heroes of flesh and blood, those who faced hardship with courage, who loved deeply, who dreamed wildly. These tales were passed like precious gifts from old to young around crackling fires beneath starlit skies, stories that kindled hope and sparked imagination, stories that carried the silent flame forward. Kratos felt the weight of history in every breath. The heavy chains of vengeance he once bore now lay broken at his feet, replaced by a lighter burden, the responsibility to guard this fragile peace, to walk among mortals, not as a god or conqueror, but as a witness, a keeper of lessons hard learned. The journey of redemption was not marked by grand battles, but by moments of quiet grace and steadfast resolve. He traveled across lands both familiar and strange, meeting faces, etched with kindness and sorrow, wisdom and wonder. Each encounter was a thread added to the tapestry of his new path. The laughter of a mother, soothing her child, the steady hands of a blacksmith shaping metal, the prayers whispered not to gods, but to the stars above. These were the true miracles, the enduring lights in a world without Olympus. The seasons turned their endless dance. Spring bloomed with wildflowers bursting in riotous color. Summer ripened fruits, heavy on branches. Autumn set forests ablaze in fiery farewell. And winter blanketed the earth in silent white. Each cycle a reminder that life persists, that endings birth beginnings, and that even in stillness there is a promise of growth. Kratos found solace in the rhythm of nature, the rising sun and the falling rain, the whispering winds and the patient stones. These were the new gods, the timeless forces that shaped existence beyond thrones or crowns, beyond the wrath of Olympus, beyond the echoes of thunder. They were eternal and impartial, carrying both the seeds of destruction and renewal as he walked beneath endless skies. Kratos understood that his own story was now part of this vast unfolding tale, a story not just of war and wrath, but of healing and hope, of breaking chains and building bridges. A story that would be carried in the hearts of those who dared to dream of freedom and light. He was no longer the ghost of Sparta, but a bearer of the silent flame, a guardian of the hollow crown, a symbol of change and the enduring strength of the mortal spirit. The scars he bore were not marks of shame, but badges of survival and transformation, reminders that even from the darkest night a new dawn could rise. In quiet moments beneath stars that blinked like watchful eyes, Kratos reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The battles, the losses, the fury, and the forgiveness. The gods who had fallen and the mortals who had risen. The endless dance of shadow and light that defined all existence. He knew the path ahead would still be fraught with challenges. The temptation to revert to old ways, the lure of power, the pain of past betrayals. But armed with the wisdom born of fire and silence, Kratos was ready to face whatever came, not with sword raised, but with heart open, with resolve steady, and spirit unbroken. The world around him was waking to a new era, an era where gods no longer ruled from distant thrones, but where mortals stood tall with voices strong and choices clear, where legends were not forged by divine decree, but by the courage to live with compassion and truth, where the silent flame burned bright in every soul, willing to carry it forward. Kratos walked on carrying the hollow crown, not as a symbol of lost dominion, but as a reminder of the price of power and the hope of renewal. The crown was empty, but it held meaning, a meaning he vowed to honor, not through conquest or fear, but through the strength to protect and the courage to change. And so the story continues, carried on the winds and in the hearts of those who listen. A story of endings and beginnings, of loss and gain, of wrath, tempered by mercy and power, guided by wisdom. The tale of the hollow crown and the silent flame, a tale that whispers across time, reminding us all that even in the absence of gods, there is still light that refuses to fade. Rest now and breathe deep. Let the quiet strength of this tale settle in your heart. Let it be a balm, a beacon. Beginning, the world turns endlessly forward, and so do we, carried by the silent flame, by the hope born from ashes, by the promise that no matter how long the night, the dawn will always come. For in the hollow crown lies the lesson of humility, and in the silent flame burns the fire of resilience. A fire that no storm can extinguish, no darkness can consume. A fire that lives in the courage of those who choose to rise again and again, with hearts open and spirits unyielding. And as you rest in this moment, know that you are part of this story, that your breath, your dreams, your light are threads woven into the vast tapestry of existence, that from the ruins of what was can come the promise of what might be, and that even in silence, there is a song waiting to be heard, a flame waiting to be kindled, a dawn waiting to break. So carry this with you as you step into your own journey. The hollow crown and the silent flame are yours to bear, not as burdens, but as gifts, gifts of understanding, gifts of strength, gifts of hope, that in the endless dance between past and future, between shadow and light, you may find your own place, your own voice, your own fire. And when the night comes again, when shadows gather in the winds, how remember the tale of the hollow crown and the silent flame. Remember the power of humility, the strength of resilience, and the enduring light of hope. For even in the darkest hour, the silent flame burns ever brighter, lighting the way for all who dare to follow. The quiet resurgence, foundations of a new world. The dawn of a new era was never heralded by thunderous proclamations or the clashing of swords. It came softly, like the slow unfurling of a delicate leaf reaching toward the sun after a long, harsh winter. Across the lands once dominated by gods and their relentless decrees, a quieter, more profound transformation was unfolding. This was the quiet resurgence, the steady, unyielding rise of mortal spirit and resilience. Kratos, no longer the weapon of divine wrath, but a witness to this renewal, moved through the waking world. His steps traced paths carved by those who dared to imagine a life beyond the shadows of Olympus. In the villages nestled between ancient forests and fertile plains, communities were knitting themselves anew. They tilled the soil not as servants to divine will, but as stewards of the earth, honoring its cycles and gifts with humility and care. The fields swayed with golden crops, the rivers sparkled with renewed life, and the air buzzed with the hum of countless voices that no longer cried out for the gods, but sang in celebration of human perseverance. The markets bustled with trades and stories. The hearths glowed warm with the laughter of families, rebuilding trust and joy after centuries of fear. Here was a world learning to breathe free, one moment at a time. This resurgence was not without its shadows. The scars of the old age lingered like faded tattoos on the skin of the world and its people. Old rivalries sparked anew, fueled by memories of betrayal and loss. The whispers of gods, though diminished, still stirred fear and superstition in quiet corners. Yet these challenges did not deter the spirit of the mortal rise. Rather, they became tests of endurance, calls to deepen resolve and compassion. Among the rising generation were those who sought to learn not from the ruins of Olympus alone, but from the earth beneath their feet and the stars above their heads. They studied the cycles of seasons and the patterns of the heavens. They crafted stories not of fearsome gods, demanding sacrifice, but of ancestors and heroes who embodied virtues of courage, kindness, and wisdom. These new myths wove a tapestry of meaning that connected past and present, heaven and earth, mortal and divine, in harmonious balance. Kratos observed these changes with a tempered heart. The rage that once fueled his every breath had softened into a quiet flame of purpose, a flame that sought not destruction, but understanding and healing. He saw in the faces of children playing beneath open skies the promise of a future where fear of gods no longer shackled dreams, and where the power to create and love rested firmly in mortal hands. He crossed paths with leaders of this new age, not kings or tyrants, but guides who listened as much as they spoke. They gathered in circles beneath ancient oaks and by roaring fires to share wisdom, to heal wounds, and to envision communities built on respect and shared stewardship rather than dominion. These gatherings were the roots of a society reborn, one where power was measured not by conquest, but by service, not by control, but by compassion. Kratos knew that this rebirth was fragile. The weight of history pressed heavily upon it, and the forces that had once ruled with thunder and flame would not fade without resistance. Yet the resilience of mortals was unlike the brittle certainty of gods. It was forged in the crucible of suffering and hope intertwined. It grew stronger with each act of kindness, each choice to forgive, each dream nurtured against the odds. In the quiet moments, Kratos reflected on his own journey, the endless cycles of wrath and redemption that had shaped him. He understood now that his path was not an end, but a beginning. The legacy he carried was not just of battles won or gods slain, but of the courage to break free from cycles that bind and to walk into the unknown with a heart open to change. As twilight deepened and stars began to flicker in the vast sky, Kratos stood upon a hill overlooking a village alive with light and life. The sounds of music and storytelling drifted upward, a living testament to the endurance of spirit and the birth of new dreams. The hollow thrones of Olympus were far behind, their silence now a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant chorus of mortal hope. In that moment, Kratos felt a peace that had eluded him through centuries of conflict. The world was not perfect, far from it, but it was free. And in freedom lay the greatest power of all, the power to choose, to love, and to build anew. And so the story turned its page not to an end, but to a chapter rich with promise. A chapter where the echoes of gods gave way to the voices of mortals, where the quiet resurgence whispered the dawn of a world reborn not by thunder or wrath, but by the steady light of hope and the enduring strength of the human heart. The last light of Olympus, a legacy beyond the gods, the horizon stretched wide and infinite, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. As day yielded slowly to night, The world below, once ruled by the thunderous will of gods, now pulsed with a quieter, heartbeat, a rhythm born of mortal hands and mortal hearts, learning to shape their own fate. The echoes of Olympus had faded into stories, whispered by the wind, carried gently over valleys and rivers, over cities and wild forests alike. They were no longer commands but memories, not decrees, but lessons waiting to be understood. Kratos stood alone on the highest peak, overlooking the lands that had once bowed beneath divine reign. His silhouette was carved sharply against the dying light, a figure both timeless and deeply mortal. The weight of countless battles and losses settled upon his shoulders, but did not crush him. Instead, it grounded him in a new truth, that power untempered by mercy is a hollow crown, and that even gods must fade for life to truly flourish. Beneath him, the world was changing still. Villages hummed with the quiet industry of daily life. Children's laughter wove through the air like delicate threads of hope. Farmers tended their fields with hands, calloused but steady, guided by the cycles of the earth rather than the whims of capricious deities. The forests, once dark and foreboding, whispered secrets to those who would listen, secrets of resilience, renewal, and the eternal dance between growth and decay. Kratos reflected on the long journey that had brought him here. Not just the path of battle and wrath, but the path of understanding and healing. The gods of old had ruled with absolute power, their thrones built on fear and obedience. But such power was fragile, destined to crumble. When faced with the indomitable will of those who refused to kneel, in their fall lay a new beginning, a chance for mortals to reclaim their stories, to write new myths grounded in the lived experience of courage, compassion, and choice. The silent flame within him burned, still not with the fury of vengeance, but with the steady light of hope. It was a beacon not just for himself, but for all who walked the uncertain path between shadow and light. This flame carried the promise that no darkness is so complete as to snuff out the possibility of dawn, that even after the longest night, the world could awaken anew. As night deepened, the stars emerged, ancient witnesses to the eternal cycle of endings and beginnings. Their cold, distant light touched the earth with a quiet blessing, reminding all who gazed upon them that life is a thread woven through time itself, unbroken even when the gods themselves fall silent. Kratos raised his eyes to the heavens, feeling neither defiance nor despair, but a profound connection to the vastness beyond. In that moment, he understood fully the legacy he would leave behind. It was not a legacy of conquest or destruction, but one of transformation. The story of gods and men was forever intertwined, but the next chapter belonged to those who dared to rise beyond the shadows of the past. It belonged to the builders, the dreamers, the quiet heroes who found strength not in wielding power, but in choosing mercy, resilience, and hope. Kratos turned from the precipice and began his descent, the path winding down toward the villages and forests below. With each step, he shed the weight of godhood, embracing the fragile beauty of mortality. The scars he bore were not marks of defeat, but badges of survival and change. They told a story not just of what had been lost, but of what could still be found. The world would never be the same, but it was alive and breathing and filled with possibility. The echoes of Olympus would linger not as chains, but as songs that would inspire generations to come to seek balance, to honor the past, while forging a future unbound by fear. And as Kratos walked into the growing night, the silent flame within him burned brighter than ever, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the quiet truth that even after the gods have fallen, life continues, hope endures, and new legends are waiting to be born. Rest now in this stillness and let the story settle in your heart. The journey of gods and men is a tapestry ever unfolding, and within it lies the promise that from every ending blooms a beginning, and that the greatest light may come from the smallest flame. So when you awaken, carry with you the strength of that flame, the courage to face the unknown, and the wisdom to walk your own path beyond the shadows, beyond the gods, beyond the hollow crowns and silent thrones, toward a dawn lit by hope and the enduring grace of a world reborn. Beyond the fading light, The world stretched on vast and uncharted, filled with the voices of those who dared to dream anew. Kratos' footsteps were slow, steady, as he descended from the sacred heights, where gods once ruled supreme, to mingle with the lives of mortals. Now unshackled from divine fear, the air smelled of earth and rain, and the faint scent of wildflowers growing untamed in forgotten places. He could hear the murmur of rivers weaving through the land, the whisper of the wind threading through tall grasses and trees. Everywhere life stirred with fragile tenacity, as if the world itself was breathing a quiet sigh of relief. Villagers below labored and laughed and loved without reverence to distant thrones. Their faith had shifted from celestial kings to the tangible touch of hands reaching out in kindness. The songs sung at hearths spoke of heroes who rose from humble beginnings, who forged their fate through courage and heart, not through divine right or terror. Kratos' gaze lingered on a child running barefoot through a field, chasing the fleeting shadow of a butterfly. The innocence in the child's eyes was untouched by the weight of gods or the scars of war. It was a vision of hope unspoiled by fear, a testament to the resilience that can bloom when old chains are broken. The child's laughter echoed through the valley like a promise whispered from one generation to the next, that life will find a way to endure and to flourish. He thought of the gods one last time, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Their power had been real and terrible, yet it was always intertwined with frailty. Their reign was marked by grandeur, but also by hubris. Their downfall was a story as old as time itself, a reminder that no force, however mighty, can bend the course of life forever, and that change is the eternal law beneath the stars. Kratos' haste felt a weight lifting as he moved through the world below a world that was no longer a stage for divine drama, but a canvas for mortal will and imagination. The people he passed did not look up in fear or awe, but exchanged glances filled with quiet determination. Their stories would be their own, no longer dictated by the edicts of gods, but born from the sweat of their brow and the fire of their spirit. The path ahead was uncertain, but alive with possibility. It was a path paved not with the blood of gods, but with the hopes and dreams of those who dared to step into the light. Kratos carried with him the silent flame, a beacon to guide others through the shadows, reminding them that even in the darkest nights, the smallest light can lead to dawn. Night deepened around him, stars scattered across the sky like scattered jewels, their light soft and distant, yet eternal. They bore witness to the endless dance of beginnings and endings, of rise and fall, of light and shadow. They were a reminder that every story is part of a greater whole, that life is a thread woven through the vast tapestry of existence. Kratos stopped for a moment and looked back toward Olympus, now a silhouette against the starlit sky. The mountain no longer loomed as a symbol of tyranny, but stood as a monument to the enduring spirit of change. It was a reminder that even the greatest thrones must yield, and that from their fall can rise new orders, new hopes, and new dreams. With a final breath, Kratos stepped forward into the night, his figure merging with the darkness, yet carrying within him the quiet light of resilience and hope. His journey was far from over, but the burden of godhood had been shed, replaced by the fragile yet powerful truth of mortality and choice. And so the last light of Olympus faded into the night, but its legacy burned brightly in the hearts of those who dared to believe that even after the gods fall, there is life, there is hope, and there are new legends yet to be written. May you carry this legacy with you as you face your own battles, your own journeys, and may you find within yourself the strength to kindle, the silent flame to walk your own path, with courage and grace, beyond the shadows, beyond the hollow crowns, toward the endless dawn of possibility. Rest now and know that every end is the seed of a beginning, and that within you lies the power to shape your own destiny, a destiny written not by gods, but by the indomitable spirit of life itself.